The Clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Public Authorities, Fraud, Error and Recovery Bill, second reading.
No.
The reasoned amendment has not been selected. Minister to move the second reading. Liz Kendall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg that the bill may now be read for a second time. This bill will help deliver the biggest ever crackdown on fraud against the public purse, which has now reached an astonishing £55 billion a year. This includes fraud against our public services, like those who abuse the tax system, dishonest companies who use deception to win public contracts and manipulate invoices, and benefit fraud by criminal gangs and individuals, which now stands at a staggering £7.4 billion a year. There have always been people who commit fraud against the state. Tragically, this is not in itself a new problem. But at a time when families across the country are working so hard to pay their bills and put food on the table, when more than 7 million people are stuck in pain and discomfort on NHS waiting lists, and when a shameful 4.3 million children in Britain are now growing up poor, it is simply unforgivable that members opposite allowed fraud to spiral out of control. During their 14 long years in government, they failed to put in place a proper plan to crack down on fraud. And there is no better symbol of this than the fact they failed to update the powers of the Department for Work and Pensions to properly crack down on benefit fraud. Just let that sink in for a moment. Over the last decade, fraudsters have become increasingly sophisticated in the techniques they use to steal people's money, using data, technology and all manner of scams. In response, banks and other companies have transformed their abilities to spot and stop fraud and protect their customers' money. But the last government completely failed to do the same for taxpayers. In all their time in power, with all the developments in technology and the ability to share data and information, they failed to update the DWP's powers. Members opposite will no doubt claim they did introduce measures. But in truth, they put forward one poorly thought through measure at the tail end of the last Parliament, tagged onto another bill without any of the proper safeguards or oversight in place. And today, Madam Deputy Speaker, all this changes with our new fraud bill. This bill is tough and it is fair. It is tough on the large companies and dodgy businessmen who try and defraud our public services. It's tough on the criminal gangs and individuals who cheat the benefits system. And it is fair to claimants who make genuine mistakes by helping us spot and prevent errors earlier on. Because taxpayers deserve to know every single pound of their hard-earned money is being wisely spent, and that benefits are only there for those who need them, not fraudsters who take advantage. I give my way.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way, and she's absolutely correct that we really need to pursue organised criminal gangs engaging in organised widespread theft. I put in a written question to the Department of Work and Pensions asking about the amounts lost in personal independence payments fraud, and the answer came back in 22 to 23, only 0.2% percentage rate. This is the DWP's answer, was fraudulently claimed by PIP claimants. So will the Secretary of State agree that whilst we pursue criminal organised gangs, it's really important that we make clear that there can't be any hostile approach to disabled people claiming PIP or disabled people more widely using the benefit system as they deserve to?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. People who are genuinely entitled to claim benefits have nothing to worry about from this bill. But we do believe that £7.4 billion wasted every year on benefit fraud must be cracked down on. So our message today is clear. To the corrupt companies with their dodgy COVID contracts, to the organised criminal gangs And to every single individual knowingly cheating the system, we will find you, we will stop you, and we will get our money back. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I don't think anybody denies if there are those who are blatantly, as I asked in the question earlier on, and the Minister responded to that, but your Minister referred to fair play. Can the Minister assure myself and in this House, when I speak later, I'll develop this course of action, or course of discussion. I'm just a bit concerned that perhaps maybe those department officials may seek out the low-hanging fruit, those people who have a genuine right to have a disability and could be denied that. The anxiety, the depression and the physical effect of what happened is my concern.
I'd say actually it's the precise opposite in this bill, because of the measures in here on the Public Sector Fraud Authority, we're saying to the large companies and the large corporations or individuals cheating, we will treat you equally. We do not allow fraud against the public purse, and we want to stop it and get our money back. I'll make a bit of progress, Madam Deputy Speaker, because I want to start with the measures the bill takes to give the Public Sector Fraud Authority the powers it needs, as a point the honourable gentleman rightly raises, to fight modern fraud across the public sector on behalf of government departments and public bodies. The bill, I will just set this out first. The bill will provide the authority with new powers to obtain search warrants, to enter premises and seize evidence as part of fraud investigations, to compel businesses and individuals to provide information where there is a suspicion of fraud, and to enable the PSFA to better detect and prevent payments made as a result of fraud or error. It will also bring in new debt recovery powers so we can get public money back for taxpayers, and new financial penalties which the PSFA can use as an alternative to often lengthy criminal prosecutions. And because what happened during the pandemic was completely unacceptable, with billions of pounds squandered by the Conservatives on dodgy deals with their COVID cronies, this bill will help us get that money back too. Doubling the time limit for civil claims to be brought in alleged cases of COVID fraud from 6 to 12 years, giving more time for the PSFA and our new COVID Counter-Fraud Commissioner to investigate complex cases to those who exploited a national emergency for their personal profit. I will give way to the honourable lady.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and I've had over a decade studying the fraud and error in DWP, and she's right that the levels of fraud have been at an intransigently high level. But my concern is about people where there are errors, quite often by the department. I had a constituent with a £5,000 overpayment. Can she be clear to the House that those people will not have money taken out of their bank accounts, and they will be treated properly where there is an error, a small error on their side, or a big error by the department?
Here. I will come on to this in a moment, but I have the utmost respect for the honourable lady, and in fact I think that the measures introduced in this bill will actually help us spot and then prevent those errors in the first place, because people make genuine mistakes, and we do not want them to build up errors and build up debt which they then have to repay. I think this bill is part of solving that problem, and I'll say more about that in a moment. Turning now to fraud and error, specifically in our welfare system. This bill will modernise and extend the DWP's anti-fraud powers, bringing them in line with other bodies like HMRC, so we can use technology and data to find and prevent fraud more quickly and effectively. So our serious and organised counter-fraud investigators have the powers they need to search premises and seize evidence, including from criminal gangs, to bring offenders to justice. And so we can ensure when people owe us money, and crucially when they can pay, we get that money back for taxpayers. All of this with strong and new safeguards and independent oversight on the face of the bill, which I will set out in detail in my speech. I'll give way to my honour.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. As she mentioned, the Conservatives didn't do very much on this except tag on a bill at the very end of their tenure. But the Information Commissioner's Office was very critical of their approach in their fraud bill. Can she reassure the House today that you have addressed those concerns?
I can indeed reassure the House. The last measure, the third-party data measure that the Conservatives introduced, the Information Commissioner was critical of that, and rightly so. Today he has written to us, and we will make sure that that letter is published, and says that he has reviewed our proposals and is very clear the measure now more tightly scopes the type of information that can and cannot be shared, specifies very much more clearly those in the scope of power, requires a code of practice that will be a statutory code of practice before measures are taken, and a requirement for the Secretary of State to appoint an independent person to carry out reviews of these functions. I am more than happy to publish that and share this with the House, because I think it shows the difference and the changes this government makes, because we are serious about getting these measures through. We understand the concerns that people have, and we have addressed them, and I think that reassurance from the independent, the Information Commissioner should give reassurance to this House. I will give way to the
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, and she has a wholehearted support of the House in pursuing the recovery of when funds are taken away through fraud and error. But the National Audit Office estimates that in the last financial year, £39 billion in tax revenue was not received due to fraud and error, as compared with £7 billion in overpaid benefits classed as fraud, which we want to pursue. But can she give some assurance to the House that an appropriate level of resources will be targeted at recovering this large sum of money, which will bring better dividends back into the Treasury?
I mean, my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise that issue, and he will know that the Chancellor and the Treasury team are indeed looking seriously at these issues. And this is the clear message from members on this side of the House, that if you're getting money that you are not entitled to and you owe money to the taxpayer, whether it's through your taxes or through fraud, that is wrong. We treat everything the same, large or small, because taxpayers want to know, when we believe in our public services, when we believe in the social security system, we want people to know that every single penny of their money is going to be wisely spent and go to those who are in the greatest need. I will, of course, give way.
Thank you very much. As a member of the party which introduced the pension, I'm obviously behind the government on this bill, because we all want to cut down on tax from fraud and evasion. But I am concerned that pensioners are also included under this blanket of government scrutiny, and it seems to me that the only thing they've done to deserve that is just get a bit old.
One of the new measures that will be introduced in this bill, the eligibility verification measure, explicitly excludes the state pension. So I want to reassure the honourable lady on that pay. I will give way.
Thank you. In places like Telford, it's a basic principle that you pay into a system and you get out of the system, or your neighbours do, when you're in need. But often the companies and the individuals who are defrauding the national benefits are also defrauding local authority benefits and schemes. Will we make sure that these powers are extended, or at least there is an ability for local government to work with national government to pursue this fraud?
I can reassure my honourable friend that local authorities can put examples in to be scrutinised by the Public Sector Fraud Authority, and the new powers this bill introduces for the PSFA are precisely to enable us to crack down on these issues. Madam I might just crack on a little bit, and then I'll obviously be happy to take an intervention later on. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to spell out each of the measures in this bill in return. First, the powers to investigate potential fraud. This bill will mean that for the first time, DWP's serious and organised crime investigators will be able to apply to a court for a warrant to enter and search the premises of suspected fraudsters and and criminal gangs to seize items for evidence, such as computers and phones. At the moment, our investigators have to rely on the police to do this. So the bill will enable us to act much more quickly, to gather evidence, to take control of and speed up investigations, while also freeing up police time. These powers will only be used when they're approved by the courts, and the police will continue to be responsible for arresting suspects. Second, the bill updates the DWP's information gathering powers as part of investigating fraud. At the moment, we only have the power to require information from a limited list of third parties. This doesn't include key organisations and sectors that could help prove or disprove suspected fraud, such as from airlines. To add to this, there's very limited ability to require responses to requests to be sent electronically. So instead, quite unbelievably, they have to be sent in writing or physically collected, which is time-consuming and cumbersome, to say the least. And I think this limitation on our powers completely underlines how long overdue the changes in this bill are, and the lack of action from the previous government. So this bill widens who the DWP can compel information from, and it will also enable us to require this information to be provided digitally by default. Third, our new eligibility verification measure will enable us to require banks or other financial institutions to provide crucial data to help identify incorrect benefit payments people might be getting, including fraudulently. For example, if someone has too much in terms of their savings that make them ineligible for a benefit, or if they are fraudulently claiming benefits abroad when they should be living in the UK. People should not be getting benefits they are not entitled to, and these alerts will make the process of identifying potential fraudsters much simpler, quicker and easier. But we also know that people lead busy lives and sometimes genuine mistakes happen. And so this measure will help here too, by finding and putting errors right quickly, preventing people from building up large debts that they then need to repay. I am absolutely determined to reduce benefit mistakes from happening in the first place and to avoid debts building up with all the worry and distress this causes, which is why I have launched the independent investigation into the overpayment of carers allowance to learn the lessons of what went wrong and to ensure it doesn't happen again. And I want to stress to the House that under our eligibility verification measure, the DWP will not be able to access people's bank accounts or look at what they are spending. We will not share any personal information with banks. Once an alert has been issued, any final decision about someone's benefits will always be taken by a human being, and the state pension will be excluded from the measure. There will also be independent oversight of this power on the face of the bill, with the requirement to produce reports and lay them before Parliament, which I'll say more about in a moment. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
I appreciate the Minister is outlining the actions which she intends to take to ensure that errors don't happen and that there is a review and a human review of that. But this bill, once a decision has been made that whether the error was genuine or not, the person should not have received the money, they then still are subject to all of the measures which would be imposed upon people who had deliberately engaged in fraud. And I think that's the real worry with this measure, that despite the assurances given, errors will still be made. And judgments will have to be made. Was that money which was given in error recoverable? And if it is recoverable, it will be treated as if it was fraud.
No, it won't be treated in the same way. I think that there is much more that we can do to use technology to prevent genuine mistakes and errors building up in the first place. But we also have to use all the technology and information sharing abilities we have to crack down on fraudsters who will use anything they can to try and defraud the system. I will come to the wider safeguards in the bill towards the end of my speech, but I would, of course, and my honourable friend, the Minister for Transformation, will be more than happy to talk with him in more detail with any other concerns that he may have. I did promise to.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way, and I'm interested to hear the measures in this bill for local authorities and public authorities, but has the Minister considered expanding the remit of the Public Sector Fraud Authority to investigate cases of serious mismanagement of funds by local authorities, like the recent botched sale of Newquay Airport by the Conservative-controlled Cornwall Council, that reportedly cost Cornish taxpayers over £1 million in consultancy fees and the like?
Shameful.
The honourable gentleman has made his point simply and clearly. This bill is about tackling fraud and people who have defrauded the public purse, but I'm sure his local newspaper will write his comments up very, very clearly. The fourth section of the bill is about widening our ability to punish fraudsters using a financial penalty as an alternative to seeking prosecutions. At the moment, we can only issue financial penalties in cases of benefit fraud. So the bill extends our ability to use them in fraud against any type of DWP payment. For example, if we had any future scheme like the Kickstart employment scheme. This will ensure more fraudsters committing a wider range of fraud can be dealt with swiftly without going to court. And fifth, last but not least, Madam Deputy Speaker, the bill also gives the DWP more power to get back public money that someone owes in cases where they can repay it but repeatedly refuse to do so. This power does not cover people on benefits or in payrolled employment, because money can already be recovered through the Social Security or PAYE systems. But for people who've moved off benefits and aren't on PAYE, for example because they're self-employed or now living off savings, this bill will enable the DWP to request bank statements of people we know owe us money but who have repeatedly refused to engage with us to verify that they have sufficient funds to repay. We can then recover this from their bank account through either a one-off lump sum or regular deductions. This will be done in a fair and manageable way, with time for the person to make any representations and the right to appeal. As a last resort, if someone owes us more than £1,000 and continues to repeatedly refuse to engage with us and agree how they will pay the money back, we can go to court and get an order to disqualify that person from driving for up to 2 years. This is the same power that the Child Maintenance Service has been able to use for the last 25 years in cases where a parent repeatedly refuses to make parents to support their child. Let me just finish this point. In considering a disqualification order, a court will always check whether the person needs a driving licence for work, because taking it away would be totally counterproductive if they do, and look at other reasons why a licence may be essential, such as if the person is a carer or is disabled. This is for people who have repeatedly refused to engage with the system. But it is an important power that the DWP should have to bring people to the table for a discussion about how they should repay the money they owe, so that we are clear. Keeping public money you're not entitled to is serious, with serious consequences as a result. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
For outlining some of the government's thinking behind Clause 91. Could you also just elaborate on whether the government's considered the fact that such a disqualification would have a disproportionate impact on somebody living, say, in remote areas as compared to those in more urban areas, due to there being much greater access to public transport?
The court will always look at whether the person, as I said, needs the car for a job, but we can't say that you're allowed to get away with fraud in different parts of the country. This is about getting money back. This is for people who have repeatedly refused to engage with us, who we know have the money that they can repay it back. And we can then bring them to table and have a discussion about that repayment. I think most members of the public would think that that is totally reasonable and fair, and that is the new power we will have. Turning now to the strong new safeguarding measures we have put in the bill. First, as I have already said, there will be independent oversight on the face of the bill for the eligibility verification measure and the new powers for the DWP and the Public Sector Fraud Authority to investigate fraud. I will appoint an independent person to oversee how the EVM measure is being used and its effectiveness. The Minister for the Cabinet Office will also appoint an independent person to review the use of the PSFA measures. Both will be required to provide reports to government, which will be published and laid before Parliament. His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, Fire and Rescue Services will oversee the investigation powers of the DWP and the Public Sector Fraud Authority, and any complaints about the use of the new search and seizure powers in the bill will be referred to the Independent Office for Police Conduct. I will.
Just on the power to request information, and it's a genuine question, I'm slightly confused about whether the DWP will be able to request information from charitable organisations who are perhaps providing support to people, or in fact from members of Parliament who may be providing support to constituents that come through our door.
The eligibility verification measure is for banks and financial institutions. It has been tightly defined, which is one of the reasons why the Information Commissioner has written his response now. The last Conservative government just had third-party data. That wasn't a serious proposal, narrowly defined with proper independent oversight. We want this legislation to pass and to be used proportionately and effectively, and that is why we've put the proposals in as they are. The second important point to state, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that there will be a statutory code of practice on how these powers can be applied, which we will consult on during the passage of the bill to clearly define scope and limitations. Third, there will always be vulnerability checks for each individual under the new debt recovery powers to ensure people aren't forced to pay back money they can't afford. And last but by no means least, final decisions affecting benefit entitlement will always be made by a human being, and these decisions will sit alongside the right to reviews and appeals, no ifs, no buts. Put together, I believe these new safeguards will provide the reassurance the public and some members of this House need that the powers contained in the bill are proportionate, safe and fair. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill delivers the biggest upgrade to the DWP's anti-fraud powers in more than 14 years. It brings in new powers to tackle fraud right across the public sector by empowering the Public Sector Fraud Authority, and not before time. Our approach is tough but fair. Tough on criminals who cheat the system and steal from taxpayers. Tough on people who refuse to pay back money. Fair on claimants, spotting and stopping errors earlier, helping avoid people getting into debt. And fair on those who play by the rules and rely on the social security system. And fair on taxpayers, ensuring every pound is spent wisely, responsibly and effectively, that every pound goes on those who need it. We were elected on a mandate for change, and that is what this bill delivers.
Yeah. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. Shadow Secretary of State, Helen Whately.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A strongly held Conservative principle is that public money must not be wasted. We hold this view not because we are mean, but because the government doesn't have money of its own. What it has, it raises through taxation from all of us. A tiny fraction of every penny it spends is yours, mine, and everyone else's who pays in. Those who spend it have a duty to spend it wisely, to make sure that it only ends up with those who should have it, for the purpose for which it was intended. Now, in a big, complex system of government in a country of nearly 70 million people, the fact is, from time to time, that won't happen for a whole range of reasons, from a form which has been accidentally filled in with the wrong information, to a change of circumstance that someone forgot to notify the job centre about, to serious, organised fraud. But however taxpayers have lost out, it is incumbent upon the state to do all it can to get their money back. That is what taxpayers rightly expect. It's part of the unwritten contract for collecting that money in the first place. Therefore, it will be no surprise to hear that in principle we support the aim of this bill. In fact, much of the bill continues work we did in government, and indeed legislation that was interrupted by the election. Madam Deputy Speaker, I think it's important to put what we're discussing today in context. Before the pandemic, fraud and error across the DWP benefits and tax credit system was at a near record low. But then we had two national crises. First the pandemic, then war in Ukraine, which piled huge cost of living pressures on families across the UK. During both, we acted rapidly. We set up never-seen-before systems of support in record time. We protected millions of people's jobs. We paid half of everyone's energy bills for a year. We got direct payments to people who needed them the most. And I'm proud of what we did. And I think history will look back kindly on how we supported people through those times. But the truth is that when you do something fast at a moment of crisis, it inevitably opens up new vulnerabilities in the system. And disappointingly, against a national spirit of getting through hard times together, some people saw it as a chance to make a quick buck. And we saw a material increase in the amount being lost to fraud within the system. Any and all of us could spell out better uses for that money. That's why, back in May 2022, we published Fighting Fraud in the Welfare System, our plan to tackle this. We increased the number of frontline counter-fraud professionals in DWP, created a new public sector fraud authority, and started work on new legal powers to investigate and punish fraudsters. It was a good start. In 2022-23, fraud and error was cut by 10%. We saved £1 billion through the department's dedicated counter-fraud activities. The next year, we upped that to £1.35 billion, exceeding the £1.3 billion target. Yet still, we weren't satisfied. In May last year, we published a second fraud plan to save £9 billion by 2027-28, which included hiring more staff to check claims for accuracy, modernising information gathering powers, broadening the penalty system, and investing £70 million in advanced data analytics. In April, we announced plans for a new fraud bill to align DWP investigations with HMRC, treating benefit fraud like tax fraud and giving investigators new powers to make seizures and arrests. And when the general election was called, the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill had already passed through the House of Commons. That bill included the powers the government is introducing today to require third parties such as banks to provide relevant information to DWP. So to the extent that this bill continues that work, I do not envisage substantial disagreement, albeit we do have questions on how the law will be put into practice. And however, I do have some serious concerns about the powers the Cabinet Office is giving itself. But before I get to those, I want to mention that I have heard, and I do recognise, concerns people have about the state getting too much information about people's finances. Privacy should never be taken lightly. I don't want to live in a country where the government can access your bank account and look at what you've been spending your money on. And I would not support a bill that allowed the government to do that. But I do believe it is right for DWP to learn lessons from HMRC in order to recoup taxpayers' money. And the fact of the matter is that if you receive money from the state, it's not unreasonable for the state to investigate if there are signs that you're taking money that you shouldn't be. On the point of how the social security powers of this bill be put into practice, as I said, I do have some questions, which I expect to probe further as the bill progresses. For instance, on the role of banks, how much testing has been done of the systems they expect to use? The Horizon scandal is a very recent reminder of how computer systems don't always get it right. What progress has been made on the Code of Conduct, and when will we see that? I also note that no impact assessment has been done on the cost to banks. Has the Minister met with the sector and discussed what these changes mean for them? I know that there are concerns within the sector about the lack of detail that DWP has brought forward. And if the maximum level of scrutiny allowed under this bill is demanded by DWP, how would that work in practice for banks and what would it cost? On the sanctions that can be meted out under this bill, we support the Department of Work and Pensions being given further powers to pursue recovery outside of benefits and PAYE. But are the measures outlined in this bill tough enough? why 40% as the maximum amount of someone's capital that can be reclaimed, allowing for hardship, which the bill does, why should someone potentially keep the majority of any ill-gotten gains? It's also not clear how this bill intends to treat carers' allowance overpayments, which I know from my time as Care Minister are complicated and often accidental, though unfortunately not always, and nonetheless a loss to the taxpayer which should be investigated. We'd also like to understand in a bit more detail how the savings we are told to expect from this bill will accrue. How many people does the government think this will affect? What proportion of the fraud currently being perpetrated? And I was also concerned the other day to see reports in the media of a number of AI schemes being quietly shelved in the department. It is noticeable that these plans rely heavily on human labour to root out fraud. Now, while I know this government has to create jobs somehow, I would be interested to hear what consideration has been given to automating some of these processes in future. That too will help to make sure taxpayers' money doesn't go to waste. But to come to my main area of concern, which is with powers being given to Cabinet Office ministers and the Public Sector Fraud Authority, I know what it's like to make legislation thinking that you, as a good person, would only use it wisely. But I also know what it's like to be wrongly investigated by a public authority on the grounds of a misleading newspaper article. And looking at the investigatory powers bestowed in Chapter 2 of the bill, how could one not be worried to see a minister being given powers with so little oversight to compel a person to release whatever information they wish to see in any format demanded within 10 days, along with the information of anyone connected to them on any grounds which the minister deems reasonable, and to disclose that information to whomever they think necessary, with the sole right of appeal being only back to that minister. It could also be impossible for someone to comply within the time frame given, yet the bill includes fines set at £300 a day for missing the deadline. So, of course, the government should go after fraudsters, but I do also worry that some of this power could be abused, and in its current form it may breach laws on the state taking someone's property without due process. So I would be interested to hear if experts within the legal sector have been consulted on the legislation as drafted. Have ministers engaged with the Law Society or the Bar Council, or for that matter with organisations like Liberty and Justice? In the Department for Work and Pensions and in the Cabinet Office, it is right to pursue fraudsters with the full might of the law, but the ends cannot justify all means, and the process must always be fair, reasonable and proportionate. And I look forward to further discussions of the detail of this bill, and I'm sure colleagues in the other place will be preparing for that too. But in the meantime, we mustn't let this bill distract from the elephant in the room, because for every penny this will save, welcome though it is, it does nothing for the billions of pounds being racked up on sickness benefits under this Labour government. It is staggering that they didn't come into office with a plan. They have done nothing to halt the tide in the 7 months they've been in office. And I also hear they have shelved some of the work we handed over. And we in this House have still not heard a murmur about what they're actually going to do. Just briefing after briefing of the papers saying they're going to do something. Why not bring an actual plan to Parliament rather than talking to the papers? I suspect Madam Deputy Speaker might be in agreement with me on this point. We had a plan. Where is theirs? Every day they scramble about without the plan, costs the country, taxpayers, millions. Fraud and error in the system is a problem. I am pleased to pledge the opposition support to tackling it, but let's not use this bill as a distraction from the big issue. We all agree that the welfare system needs reform. Let's end the briefings and have some action.
Now, before I call the next speaker, I just wanted to make it clear that after the Honourable Member for Oldham East and Saddleworth, I'll be calling the Liberal Democrat spokesman. Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's absolutely right that fraud against the taxpayer, whoever that is by, is detected, money is recovered and future fraud is prevented. The fraud that we saw, for example, during COVID, when the abuse that we saw on the bounce back loan as one example cost the taxpayer nearly $5.5 billion. There are also other aspects of the COVID-related contracts, such as the purchasing of unusable PPE, has been absolutely outrageous. As my right honourable friend has mentioned, the National Audit Office identified 6 areas of risk for fraud against the public sector, which is estimated at costing the taxpayer between £55 and £85 billion a year. Grant fraud is one, misappropriation or misuse of grant money. Service user fraud, which is very much what we seem to have been focusing on today, Madam Deputy Speaker. Procurement and commercial fraud, income evasion, internal fraud and corruption, and regulatory fraud. In its 2023-24 annual report and accounts, the DWP estimated that it made overpayments, including fraud and error, of £9.7 billion out of the £269 billion it spent. So that's 6.7% of related expenditure. But it also made underpayments of £4.2 billion. That's 1.6% of related expenditure. And that's up from £3.5 billion from the previous year, which was due to underpayments of disability living allowance. Within this, there were different levels of fraud for different benefit types. For universal credit, the level of overpayments for the same period is 13.2%. Now, this is actually down from a peak of over 21% in early 2020 during COVID, when some of the controls were suspended to speed up the application process. In fact, 2/3 of all overpayments by value are in universal credit, £6.5 billion out of the £9.7 billion. The DWP has tried to argue that the increase in fraud in the social security system reflects an increase in fraudulent behaviour in society. However, this doesn't explain why the overpayments are concentrated in universal credit accounts, or why, for example, there was a 10% reduction in fraud incidents reported in the crime survey for England and Wales between 2023 and 2024. The National Audit Office and Public Accounts Committee agree. In their recent report on the DWP's annual accounts, PAC said it is not convinced that the DW claims adding this is a dangerous mindset. They also produced the following context, which I think we should all consider. It is concerning that the DWP is not providing a decent service to all its customers, who include some of the most vulnerable in society and some of those with the most complex needs. In particular, claimants of disability benefits, including personal independence payment and employment support allowance, are receiving unacceptably poor service, including processing times compared with those receiving universal credit and state pension. I worry that many of these disabled claimants, made vulnerable by their circumstances, are receiving less than the DWP estimates they're entitled to. I believe there is the genuine commitment from ministers to change DWP's culture and build trust with its service users. But to many, the bill will be seen as more evidence not to trust the DWP and not to engage. And I don't think I'm alone in this. In their evidence of the Work and Pension Select Committee Safeguarding Vulnerable Claimants Inquiry, Citizens' Advice raised concerns that failure to engage is the second largest category of DWP classes, that the DWP classes as fraud, and that when the enhanced review team identifies a household for potentially fraudulent claim, payments may be immediately suspended. They recommended that the detriment caused by such a suspension should not take place while the fraud review process is ongoing. Disability Rights UK and also UK Finance and others have raised issues about the lack of systemic safeguards in the bill. And I know, to their credit, ministers have accepted this and are going to be looking at this as a whole. But ministers, particularly from the other side of the House, will also remember the housing benefit fraud allegations. where more than 200,000 people were wrongly accused and investigated for housing benefit fraud and error last June. In this, Madam Deputy Speaker, an AI algorithm, such as just has been mentioned that we should be using more of, incorrectly identified people that were potentially behaving fraudulently, and they were investigated. Now, that is really serious. And I just wondered if ministers are able to share with us what they consider an acceptable level of innocent people who will be investigated as it currently stands. Policy and practice have also raised concerns of underclaiming and barriers to access support, the lack of value for money of DWP's fraud detection, prevention and recovery system, addressing less than 5% of the I can't read my own writing here, but it's less than 5%, I think, of the debt that's owed, and how the focus on fraudulent claims is spoiling the system for the 97% of genuine benefits claiming, fueling beliefs about benefit cheats and detracting from the millions of households that are rightfully and legitimately supported by a social safety net designed to be there for all of us in our time of need. So my questions to the ministers, and some of them I've already raised, is what risk assessments have been undertaken on the bill? I know there's an impact assessment, I know there's a human rights assessment. What were these risks and the mitigations that have been put in place? Will the government publish these? How were safeguarding concerns addressed in the bill? And that includes the Caldecott principles and the responsibilities of the Caldecott Guardian that the DWP, to their credit, have now got in place. This is too important of a bill for us to mess this up and innocent people to become the victims. Thank you.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Steve Darling.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I first of all thank the member for Oldham East and Saddleworth for laying out very concisely some of the challenges that there are with making sure that this bill does the right thing, but actually could potentially going too far and actually breaking some of the things that people want to see fixed. Deputy Speaker, clearly defrauding the benefit system is wrong. One only has to reflect on the level of disinvestment that we've seen under the previous government of many of our public services to know how this can bleed the system dry. As I reflect on my own constituency of Torbay, I can only think of the tower block at Torbay Hospital that has scaffolding around it, not because it is under repair, but because it is to stop bits of concrete falling and killing people. I reflect on the lack of investment in our schools, where because of RAC and the challenges around that, modernisation of our schools will not, that capital programme that needs to happen, will not happen for the next 6 years. A lack of investment in our police services that sees the numbers of sworn officers massively reduced. So these are serious issues that have affected us, and we've seen a lack of investment under the previous Conservative government. The previous Conservative government were asleep at the wheel during the COVID pandemic, as the Secretary of State has already alluded to in very clear terms. Business people in Torbay shared with me that they felt that Rishi Sunak was filling carrier bags.
I need to remind the honourable member that we do not refer to members and right honourable members by their name, but by their constituency. I think he's referring to the right honourable member for Richmond and North Allerton.
Apologies. Thank you. That the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time was filling carrier bags full of £50 notes and placing them around towns, expecting people just to pick them up. So low were the safeguards around a number of the COVID support schemes. I would like to go on to an item that has already been covered by a number of colleagues already,
which is the carers scandal, where over 136,000 people are left with liabilities that they are extremely worried about. That is the population of West Bromwich, left owing £250 million. And yet the government have quite rightly commissioned a review into this, and that review is not due to report in the very near future, but next summer. And so I would challenge the Minister, why are we not waiting for the findings from that review to come to fruition so we can make sure that lessons are learned before we push hard on these proposals? Because we want to see fraud tackled, but we want to see it done in the right way. There have just been 7 working days between the publishing, the first reading of this bill and the second reading of this bill. There are large tracts of some of the safeguards and the rails around this bill that are out to consultation as we speak before we can come to an understanding of what safeguards there really will be there to protect our communities. AI. Colleagues have already mentioned AI, and they're right to, because there are real concerns that there is a lack of transparency. I know Liberal Democrats have already highlighted how sorry, Jenny's joining in slightly, having a dream about rabbits, how AI could be, we don't know what those safeguards around there, and how can we be backing this bill until we know what AI, what safeguards there will be in those areas. I would also like to reflect to colleagues as to how how this bill can have those appropriate safeguards. One reflects on how the DWP is actually a broken system, and the colleague just prior to me highlighted how the DWP is a broken department, sadly. One only has to reflect. I'm happy to give way to my colleague.
He does cite that, and would he agree with me that what we actually see in regards to the monies being claimed back from unpaid carers, in regards to that concerns that we have around DWP, that this legislation would actually see more unpaid carers or their like actually come under far harder and far harsher penalties?
Thank you, and I would like to welcome the intervention from my colleague and say that he is spot on highlighting this as a serious issue. One only has to reflect, Madam Chair, or Madam Speaker, how there is a significant backlog of 90,000 people waiting for their pension to be reviewed as part of the winter fuel allowance issues that has kicked in here, and that is a massive backlog. The access to work system that is meant to be there to support people with disabilities into work, again, is sadly a broken system. Quite often, those wishing to receive it will find that job offers are withdrawn from them because the work package hasn't been pulled together in time for them. I'm aware of an academic survey that highlighted that over 3 years, sadly, 600 people, almost 600 people, had committed suicide around the management of their support from the DWP. So, Secretary of State, I would suggest that the fact of the matter is that whilst one understands the aspirations of this bill, it is far too much of a Big Brother bill, it is far too much of a Snoopers Charter, and I would suggest to the Minister that they withdraw this bill. Thank you.
Oliver Ryan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to start by thanking the Minister for bringing this important bill. Fraud is a serious issue, and we simply can't tolerate the level of fraud we've been left by the previous government. We almost spent as much as we spent on defence as we lost to fraud in the year 23-24. We've all heard the stories. People fraudulently claiming COVID support, people claiming benefits they're not entitled to, people claiming from the safety net, not for security in their time of need, but to feather their own nests on the backs of British taxpayers. I'm glad to see this government being serious about protecting public money from fraudsters, and I have no time for the whataboutery of the Liberal Democrats. This robust bill closes loopholes, strengthens enforcement and prioritises financial accountability. A great step forward in the real change that we promised at the election. The message from me and from my constituents is quite clear. If you defraud or attempt to defraud the British public in any way, you deserve to feel the full weight of the law. I believe in doing what's right to protect taxpayers and hard-working people in business. And that's why I won't stand by while fraudsters take advantage of the system. This bill says, if you have defrauded the British taxpayer, we will come for you and will not mess about. That's what people in Burnley, Pavilion and Brighton want. On the strengthening of COVID fraud-related measures specifically, I'm proud that one of the first actions this government took was to appoint the COVID Corruption Commissioner, and that this bill bolsters their powers and doubles the time limit for civil claims to be brought, amongst other measures. A typical example of rampant COVID corruption was the bounce-back loans, which have been referred to by the members today in the debate, which saw millions of pounds of public money shovelled out of the doors of the Treasury without proper oversight. And we've all read the stories and some of the heinous outcomes. Huge amounts of public money gone to fake companies or people using stolen identities, providing products that were defected or just plain didn't exist. Meanwhile, I've had to explain to my constituents why basic public services have gone to the wall. Just to put it all into perspective, all in, they handed the equivalent of £20,000 of taxpayers' cash to fraudsters every minute of the last Parliament, and now moan that there isn't money for anything. If this bill had been passed earlier, much of this could have been prevented by allowing stronger eligibility verification procedures, faster detection of fraudulent transactions and faster financial recovery powers for quicker action against fraudsters. Now, I want to move on specifically to benefit fraud and the Department of Work and Pensions. Madam Deputy Speaker, the same principle applies. Defraud the British public and you will feel the full weight of the law. You will have nowhere to hide. We have a moral duty to recover every penny of public money that has been defrauded, and I'm glad to see the bill full-throatedly saying that. Benefit fraud has tripled since 2019, and we've lost almost £10 billion to fraud and error overall since that time. Indeed, as the now Leader of the Opposition said whilst in government, fraudsters were, in her words, let off the hook by the Tories. Madam Deputy Speaker, people who work hard to pay their taxes deserve to know that every pound stolen is a pound that can't be spent on public services, and they deserve to have it returned. It is simply unforgivable that they allowed fraud and the benefit system to get to this level. By voting in favour of the bill, we will allow this government crucial investigatory powers and search and seizure powers that are essential if we really want to tackle fraud in this country. I know there will be some concern from some quarters, but I am reassured that the Secretary of State has taken into consideration necessary safeguards to balance the need for effective fraud prevention and recovery. Indeed, if during the passage of the bill she finds a way to be tougher and go further, she should do it. I'm not sure if 2 years is enough for a driving ban. The powers we're extending to the Public Sector Fraud Authority are already proven to be effective, used by the DWP and HMRC, and by expanding these powers, we will recover more funds and bring more fraudsters to justice. I mean, this is the first update in powers that we've seen in 20 years, as she said earlier. Of course, DWP investigators should be given warrant powers, if nothing else, to save police time. These safeguards are there to make sure we tackle fraud effectively and, as importantly, protecting people's rights, as she said. Indeed, as for any decision affecting somebody's benefits, I know that the Shadow Minister raised it a second ago, decisions will be made in the final stages by a human being, which I think is right, and clearly that's something the Secretary of State has tried to stipulate. In Burnley, Pavilion and Brighton, people expect their money to be used effectively, and they demand accountability, with fraudsters who exploit the system held to account and locked up if necessary. So, as the Secretary of State said, it's tough, but it's fair, with measures designed to save an awful lot of money over the next 5 years. This is a very, very promising step that I believe will restore public trust and tackle financial mismanagement. I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for taking this so seriously. More power to her elbow. Thank you.
Peter Bedford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to echo many of the points raised by my honourable friend, the Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. Like her, I am a conditional supporter of this bill. Whilst I welcome its intent, I would like to raise a few questions regarding its implementation and its true impact on reducing fraud and error within the system. Members on the Conservative benches understand three core principles: the importance of promoting personal responsibility, the importance of law and order, and of course the importance of reducing the burden of an overreaching state and ensuring that taxpayers' money is spent efficiently. I am pleased, therefore, the Secretary of State, through bringing this legislation, appears to have accepted the long-standing arguments advocated by this side of the House. This bill, much like the policy paper of the previous government, is both necessary and overdue. It is a scandal that fraud and error in the DWP benefit system has reached such levels. Since the pandemic, the UK taxpayer has overpaid £8 billion due to lack of proper provision for the DWP to thoroughly investigate cases of fraud and error. This bill is maintaining the focus of the previous government's policy paper to fight fraud in the system. Under the work of the now Shadow Chancellor, the DWP saw a 10% drop in fraud and error within the system, which led to savings of over £2 billion between 2022 and 2024. This was achieved through the department recruiting over 2,000 review agents and also hiring 1,400 counter-fraud professionals. But unfortunately, due to the time constraints at the end of the last parliamentary session, the Shadow Chancellor was not able to carry out the modernisation of information-gathering powers and also broaden the scope of cases that could lead to civil penalties. I have no doubt that had those Conservative policies been fully implemented, fraud and error levels would be lower than they are now. Now, turning to the bill itself, while I support the principles, I do seek clarifications from the Secretary of State on several key points. Firstly, can the Secretary of State guarantee that this bill will not distract her and the Department from much-needed reforms to counter benefit conditionality? I'll give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and he's making an excellent contribution to this, and I too support what he's been saying. We must get benefit fraud down, and I support some of the measures in the bill that the government is trying to bring forward. And on the specific point that he's just raising, does he agree with me that this is only one side of the coin to dealing with benefits in this country? Of course, we must do everything we can to get the benefit fraud down, but the other side of that coin is encouraging people to go back to work, because the best form of welfare in this country is having a well-paid job.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. I absolutely agree with all the sentiments he expressed. Getting into work, getting a job is the best route out of poverty, and it's the best route to ensuring we have a more socially mobile society. So, turning back to my point, if the Secretary of State, can she guarantee this bill will not distract her and the Department from much-needed reforms on benefit conditionality, including work on health assessments and also increasing incentives for people to find work? Secondly, my instinctive belief in personal liberty means that I believe provisions allowing access to individuals' bank accounts must be handled with caution. Can the Secretary of State therefore confirm that such measures will only be used as a last resort, and the independent person appointed by the Cabinet Office will be given full oversight and report transparently on the use of these powers? Thirdly, the bill proposes the restriction of driving licences for those committing fraud against the DWP. However, what alternative deterrents does the Secretary of State propose for those who do not drive? HMRC and the CMS already have these powers. I would like to see the independent person assess whether these measures are as impactful at the DWP. Fourthly, Gareth Davies, Comptroller and Auditor General for the National Audit Office, wrote last year that the forecast shows that DWP no longer expects universal credit fraud and error to remain the level seen before the COVID-19 pandemic. In response, the DWP explained that this was because there has been an increasing propensity for deceit across British society. I do hope that the Secretary of State will push back against this defeatist culture within the DWP, and that my constituents in Mid-Leicestershire do not continue to foot an astronomical bill for people committing fraud in the department. And finally, to gauge what is the correct path when dealing with fraud and error in the system, will the independent person conduct a review to determine whether the provisions in this bill are just as effective as the Conservative-led policies of the previous government? So, in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, as a Conservative, I support the intent of this bill. It is shocking that fraud and error is at current levels. However, I urge the Secretary of State to work collaboratively with members on all sides of the House to ensure that individual freedoms are respected, that the bill does not distract from wider welfare reforms, and that the measures in this legislation deliver a long-term reduction in the welfare bill.
Gill German.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill is crucial for delivering on this government's manifesto commitment to safeguard taxpayers' money. As the Secretary of State has rightly stated, we must turn off the tap to criminals who cheat the system and steal law-abiding taxpayers' money. In Wales alone, the National Fraud Initiative found £7.1 million worth of fraud and payment errors in 2022 to 23, up 0.6 million since the previous year. Figures like this show just how much a blight on the economy fraud and error continues to be. I've heard first-hand from constituents about instances of benefit fraud that they are well aware of, such as individuals using past addresses to make claims they're not entitled to. And they know that this isn't right, and they expect us to take action. It's also, of course, essential that we crack down on organised crime gangs and streamline the process through which DWP investigators can act to ensure that these serious offenders are brought to justice more swiftly. I welcome this government's crackdown on fraud because every pound lost to fraudulent claims is a pound that could be spent on vital public services. Services my constituents in Clwyd North rely on to strengthen our communities and improve lives. However, it is crucial that we make a clear distinction between intentional fraud and accidental individual error. Errors leading to overpayments may not be the result of deliberate wrongdoing, but rather the inherent complexity of the social security system itself. Many of my constituents have shared their struggles with the complexity of applying for benefits and knowing what to apply for and how. This causes significant stress and exemplifies the risks of penalising individuals who may have simply been unable to navigate the system, further entrenching the fear of making a mistake. This bill, therefore, must go hand in hand with reforms to make this navigation far more straightforward. A YouGov survey for Turn to Us in 2024 found that 77% of respondents believed they would struggle if they needed to claim benefits if their circumstances changed. This highlights the real challenges people face in navigating a system that is often confusing and difficult to understand. The government must ensure that its powers to recover overpayments differentiate between fraudulent criminal activity and genuine mistakes. Without this distinction, there is a risk of penalising individuals who have simply struggled to navigate the system, people who may already be in vulnerable situations. Getting this bill right, though, means that £1.5 billion of taxpayers' money over 5 years will be saved. Money that can be invested into the services that people like those in my constituency of Clwyd North and across the country rely on, from public transport to local infrastructure. With fraud and error costing nearly £10 billion a year, we must act decisively to drive down this fraud and error and protect public funds. At a time when families are struggling and public services are under pressure, ensuring taxpayers' money is spent where it's truly needed is not just responsible, it's essential. This bill must tackle fraud and error in a way that is fair, proportionate and does not punish those who have made an honest mistake. And I know that the government has worked hard to put into the bill measures that will ensure that these critical distinctions are made as the bill progresses. However, it is crucial that we do not shy away from coming down on this issue and ensure constituents see their hard-earned contributions going directly to the services that strengthen our communities.
Madam Deputy Speaker, This bill is at heart a Conservative legislation. It's left over from the most dark corner of the last administration, and I've no qualms in opposing it today. I will speak against giving this bill a second reading, and along with my fellow Green members, we will vote against it later on. Now, one of the changes that people wanted to see when they voted the last government out was a welfare system that treats people with dignity and respect. But sadly, this bill is instead based on blame and suspicion of people in need of help, and a focus on fraud, when a far bigger issue is unclaimed and underclaimed benefits due to lack of awareness, complexity in the system and stigma. These people losing out are not helped by this legislation, along with the risk laid out by the Honourable Member who's chair of the Select Committee of damaging trust and engagement with the DWP. We've also got the reigniting of damaging and unfair stereotypes from some people involved in the wider debates around these issues on social media, in newspapers and in broadcast media. All in all, this bill is deeply concerning and disappointing, and I had hoped better of this government on this issue. I sincerely hope the ministers will go back to the drawing board and come up with a new, fair and humane policy for dealing with what is a very small proportion of fraud in our benefit system. I've had so much correspondence on this from people in my constituency of Brighton Pavilion who are very concerned about the sweeping powers of this bill to invade their privacy and treat them as suspects, not citizens. I'm talking about pensioners who need pension credit, people who are permanently disabled, who's entitled to employment support allowance is clear and settled, people who are precariously under or unemployed who need universal credit, family carers, and people who are simply on low wages where they cannot make ends meet. These are citizens, not suspects. While the clauses about what appear to be routine and regular government access to information from bank accounts for eligibility verification, not linked to serious crime, these clauses most concern me. I'm also opposed to clauses that increase powers of search and access to homes for more serious matters, and those which would remove driving licences from those who are having difficulty paying back the Department for Work and Pensions overpaid money due to what may simply be human error at a difficult time in their lives, not fraud at all. I therefore suggest that the government comes back to this House with the parts relating to COVID fraud, to contractors and businesses, and maybe add something on the much bigger problem of tax fraud. But on the rest, I suggest it starts again and starts with the process of genuine listening and co-production with those who claim social security about appropriate, fair, respectful and secure ways to make sure people in need of support are able to receive what they're entitled to, and which secures in a proportionate way against those who might seek to defraud the government or local authorities. This process would fit together very well with a recent proposal from the charity Mind in response to other upcoming changes to benefit processes. This asks for a new approach to the benefit system and a commission led by disabled people to redesign benefit assessments. Mind says this kind of process would help to rebuild trust between disabled people and the DWP, and I agree. And my personal view is that this bill today will do the absolute opposite. In summary, I believe this bill should go no further, and I and my Green colleagues will be voting accordingly today to stand up for our constituents' rights and their dignity, and for social security based not on intrusion and suspicion, but on support.
John Trickett.
Thank you very much, ma'am. A few points, really. First of all, it would be impossible not to note the zeal of the Secretary of State when she was banging on the dispatch box about fraud and loss to the taxpayer. And she's right to do that. We, on this side of this House at least, believe in public expenditure, and therefore every single penny, I think there's a duty on us to ensure that it's spent in an appropriate manner. So where it's wasted, where it's stolen, or there's fraud going on, we should bear down on it. But although she started off with that zeal, the passion, talking about the gangs and the other people, most of the things she talked about were about benefit claimants. And the bill itself, though it does set up powers for the Fraud Authority, deals largely with the question of fraud in the benefit system. But the title of the bill talks about both fraud but also error. And not enough time, it seems to me, has been spent in this debate on the nature of error, which is far bigger than as can really be easily acknowledged. So I looked at the figures for the PIP. Between 2019 and 2024, of all the cases taken for alleged fraud by recipients of PIP, 1 in 4 were dropped before they got to an appeal, indicating that the decision had lapsed because the department had decided in favour of the appellant. And that, I think, indicates to some extent the scale of error which this bill is also wanting to address. But and I'm going to refer to a couple of cases in a moment or two, but let me just say it seems to me that at the core of this bill is the creation effectively of a partnership between the state and the private banks. And it's not clear exactly when you read the bill what that partnership is going to look like. And I would hope that before we get into committee stage, we can get some clarity on that. But let me just return to, let me just say one thing about the banks. The banks themselves have said that they're very, very worried about this bill. Why? Because they have a statutory duty imposed by this House to make sure that they deal properly with clients who are vulnerable. And they have said that there is a contradiction between, on the one hand, the contents of this bill, the obligations which fall upon the banks, and their duty to treat people who are vulnerable in a proper way. And I want to just reflect on that briefly in the following comments. Let me give the House a case from my own constituency. And what happened in this case is, I think, symptomatic of a wider problem. A couple were referred to my office. They both had learning difficulties, both were illiterate and innumerate, and they found it impossible on their own to fill in the dozens and dozens of questions which the forms require you to fill in order to get access to the benefits. And so they were helped to put the form together by people who were employed to look after such people. The DWP then decided, years later, that they'd made an error and they'd overpaid the couple by a large amount of money. And this error came to light, I think, as a result of some kind of review within the department. But here's the thing. Here's a very, very poor couple, vulnerable, unable really to fill in the form on their own, helped by professionals. What did the government do, or the state? They sent them a bill for £20,000. Now, you can imagine, I imagine everybody in this House has a great deal of empathy, but wouldn't be in this job otherwise. We can imagine the state that that couple was left in when they received a bill from the state to repay £20,000. Bear in mind, it was discovered after they came to my office that in fact they'd filled all the forms incorrectly. This was an error, a computer error by somebody failing to key in some of the information which had been provided to the DWP. Here's the thing, neither the council, which was helping them, nor their support workers spotted the fact that they were being overpaid. Nobody spotted it. So it went on for a number of years. £20,000. And you know, so a couple in a deeply vulnerable situation, left with a situation like that. Eventually, they encountered a local councillor in my constituency who referred them to me. And we went through the whole thing. We managed to make an appeal on their behalf. But here's a further point I want to make. This bill gives you only 28 days once you've received an order to pay. Now, it took us longer than 28 days once it got into my office to try to resolve this. I just say to the Secretary of State, 28 days is not enough in these complicated cases to produce the evidence to show that you are the victim of error rather than having committed a fraud. And there was a presumption by the state that they had committed a fraud of £20,000. Totally incorrect, as it turned out. I worry that the bill is going to put people like my constituents, and I imagine every honourable and rightable member's constituents in this House, in the same position as my constituents. They were fortunate they found an MP, but many people in that situation wouldn't know how to find their way through the system. Now, that then raises the question which I've already referred to about the bank. The banks have got a statutory duty to protect vulnerable customers. How will they exercise that duty when they've been required to provide information to the DWP about the financial activities of various individuals who are banking with them? And on the subject of vulnerability, Disability Rights UK tell us that 1/3 of all claimants on legacy benefits have mental health problems. 1/3. I imagine that most of those people will be regarded by the banks and by everybody, every humane person in this House, as vulnerable. And therefore, one wonders just exactly how we're going to reconcile the statutory duty on the banks with what they're required to do in relation to this particular bill. Now, we are giving powers to this fraud authority. I personally am in favour of tackling fraud. I've already said that. I'm a Yorkshireman. I don't like spending money, and I don't like money being spent wastefully by the state either. And when I was a leader of Leeds, everybody knew that I was very, 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 very strong on waste. But let's have a look at this question of my final point on vulnerability. Has the government commissioned and received an equality impact assessment? And if it has, can it be placed in the Commons Library? Because it will clearly have an impact on people who are extremely vulnerable, and I think there will be something somewhere in the department which refers to that impact assessment. But I was just going to make a couple of final points. The bill, it suggested, will save £300 million a year by tackling benefit fraud. £300 million a year. It's a large amount of money, but by comparison with the £10 billion fraud on PPE provided during COVID, on the £16 billion lost to the taxpayer in fraudulent COVID schemes, by comparison with the £5.5 billion tax evasion a year and £6 billion of other illegal activities against the HMRC, the £300 billion is important, but it's not the largest amount of fraud which is taking place. So I think my question is this. If the new the new powers of the fraud authority that's going to be staffed up with red and sorted, how will they deal between the disproportionate amounts by which the state is being defrauded by various different agencies and by private individuals, and frankly some gangsters too? Will the staffing be allocated according to the prejudices of politicians, whichever politicians are then in charge, or will it be actually addressed by the proportionate loss to the taxpayer which has been incurred by different forms of fraud? And so my final point, the Information Commissioner, until the Secretary of State suddenly announced that she's received a letter today, which I fully understand, it'd be interesting to read it, was suggesting that the powers were disproportionate, and I think we just need to see the letter, and hopefully it will go into the library or somewhere. And so here we are, clause 74, which empowers Schedule 3 in the bill, go right to the kernel of the problems with this bill, and they could not be clearer. But I'm worried that it's not apparent how the intervention of banks will be invoked. Clause 4, Schedule 3 allows the banks to be invoked. and then for action to be taken place. Will that be every single citizen in the UK whose bank account will be looked at? That is the view of some campaign groups in society. If so, that is a massive incursion into the liberty which the British people hold dear. If it's not, then how will the banks be asked to identify particular individuals? What process will be gone through? It's not clear. The bill doesn't explain it. I've read clause 74 2 or 3 times, as many other people. And finally this. On the right of appeal, which I've just referred to, the 28 days, can we be assured, not necessarily now, but as the debate goes through its various processes, just exactly how that appeal situation will work? And can I ask the Secretary of State, can we look again at about this 28-day cut-off? It seems to me slightly too tight.
David Chadwick.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I say it's an honour to follow such an excellent speech from the Honourable Member for Normanton and Hemsworth. As a Welsh Liberal Democrat, I find myself concerned with the civil liberties aspect of this bill, particularly the influence and the power it gives to the big banks. I spent 7 years working in data privacy as a data protection consultant, and reading this bill sort of created more questions than it answered for me. I worked on data sets for different businesses and organisations from across the world, involving both businesses and governments, as I said. And in particular, I want to speak to the points around the banks, because as we speak, customers from Lloyds and Halifax, for example, cannot currently access their bank accounts because of an outage. So we should be concerned about making banks the judge, juries and executioners of social policy, particularly something as important as welfare policy. The UK has strong data protection laws that have been carefully negotiated over time and inherited from the European Union, and this bill threatens to erode some of those protections and potentially implicates treaties that we've already signed, such as the data adequacy agreement that we have with the European Union. And if the EU were to turn around and say that they are unhappy with the government's decision to monitor its own subjects and citizens in this way, that would create many more problems for organisations across the UK. Citizens should have the right to object to automated decision-making. And I struggle to see how asking banks to scan their datasets for potential fraud could not be regarded as decision-making. So let's give citizens the right to be able to object to these decisions that are being made about them. And if they're not, as I said, we might be violating the data privacy agreements that we already have in place. What does the government expect the process to look like when it's asking the banks to provide this information? The Secretary of State said that the information would be provided in a digital format, but I repeat, what is that going to actually look like in practice? What could possibly go wrong if, as has been mentioned already, the banks are having to relay huge data sets to the government and to the DWP in particular? For example, that can create honeypots of data that might be easier for hackers to intercept and interfere with. And in data protection, if you can't make data, if you don't have data integrity, availability and confidentiality, then essentially all of the agreements you have that exist even with the data subject and the data processor can be said to not be valid. And therefore, I wonder what the government sees as the perfect framework for this data to be provided. Does it mean that the banks will have to export the names of everyone who has over £16,000 in savings and send that to the government to see whether or not they are actually in receipt of welfare payments? One of the core principles of a free society is the right to privacy. And yet, in its current form, this bill represents an intrusion by the state into the privacy of individual citizens. Under the bill, the government would be granted sweeping powers to access and monitor the personal financial records of citizens, even without any evidence of suspicious activity to justify such actions. Now, many people are in receipt of welfare payments through no fault of their own, and this bill would potentially result in the mass surveillance of private financial information, potentially affecting 9.4 million citizens. The presumption of innocence is a cornerstone of our justice system, yet the bill would fundamentally alter that principle. And under the bill, individuals could be presumed guilty until proven innocent, with their personal data shared, investigated and scrutinised without sufficient cause or due process. This sets a dangerous precedent where the burden of proof falls on citizens, not the state. We've all seen the devastating impact of errors made by the Department for Work and Pensions, DWP, on individuals. A system like this could lead to disastrous consequences when it falsely flags someone as fraudulent due to simple administrative errors or unintentional mistakes. And the member speaking previously acknowledged that the banks themselves have raised concerns about whether or not they should be the right organisation to do so. The bill risks creating a two-tier society where certain groups are subjected to intrusive financial monitoring by the state while others are not. And this undermines the principles of equality and fairness that our society is built upon. And we should acknowledge that in the current climate, when banks are closing branches left, right and centre, it should again not be the government's job to ask banks to act as the judge, juries and executioners of social welfare policy, particularly when the government is granting itself access to people's bank accounts, but not requiring the banks, particularly in areas like Pinto-Duschinsky, where they've just lost the Lloyds Bank have just announced that they're going to close, when the government is not requiring the banks to allow the citizens to access their bank accounts, but is giving itself the power to do so on their behalf. That does not sit well with the liberal society that I want to live in, and I don't believe that my citizens want to live in such a society either. So I'm calling on the government to rethink its proposals and also to assure us that this bill will not undermine the data protection adequacy agreement that we have with the European Union.
David Pinto-Duschinsky.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've heard a lot of statistics and lots of detailed policy questions today, but I want to start by sharing two stories. The first is of Antonia Foods in Wood Green, North London. From the outside, it looked like a normal neighbourhood corner shop, selling fruit, veg and groceries. But from its back room, Galina Nikolova and Gunesh Ali ran a vast fraud operation, making use of transnational networks to file hundreds of illegal UC claims. By the time they were caught, they had defrauded DWP of over £50 million. When the police finally raided their addresses, they found cases stuffed with cash. Nikolova and Ali received prison sentences, as did many of their associates. But the reality is that most of the money they claimed had long since disappeared, likely spirited out of the country. They had successfully stolen from us all. The second story is of Yvonne. She is a disabled woman who was paid thousands of pounds more in benefits than she was entitled to over a number of years as a result of an innocent mistake, and is now struggling to make ends meet as DWP deducts overpayments from her current entitlement. Madam Deputy Speaker, both these stories illustrate why we so desperately need this bill today. The extent to which fraud against the public purse has spread under the last government is breathtaking. The proportions are simply staggering. As my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, said, public sector losses amounted to £55 billion last year. That's as much as the defence budget, or 3 times what we spend on police in England and Wales. That loss costs every man, woman and child in this country £800 a year. It takes the equivalent of a third of the entire national VAT tax take. Now, this is not a victimless crime, some technical infringement. It robs every family in Britain. It erodes our public services,
and it takes money that could be used to help those most in need, depriving the most vulnerable of support. My constituents in Hendon and people across the country rightly expect it to be tackled. This is a crime that feeds on the most disadvantaged and not only weakens public services, but also the public's faith in them and their fairness. And I say gently to those who have so far criticised this bill that there is nothing progressive and nothing compassionate about allowing fraud to fester. It is a scourge that must be tackled. And it's a scourge that grew out of control and professionalised under the last government. Perhaps no area illustrates the challenge we face, how it evolved, and the last government's catastrophic failure to curb fraud than that of benefits. Today, DWP's net bill for fraud and error, even after deducting for underpayments, is £8.6 billion. That's £272 a second, £16,300 a minute, almost £1 million an hour. In the time it takes us to have this debate this evening, DWP will have lost over £3 million. The bill for fraud and error is roughly the same as the department's entire programme budget. DWP loses as much in fraud and error as it spends on every active programme it has to help the unemployed, the long-term sick, those with disabilities and the elderly. The picture is shocking, and it got much, much worse under the party opposite. The headline figures for fraud and error, excluding our underpayment, tripled in cash terms between 2010 and 2024 from 3.3 to 9.7 billion. And as bad as these figures are, that actually understates how badly things deteriorated under the party opposite. Claimant error rose only slightly in cash terms, while official error remained flat. In contrast, fraud rose a stunning sevenfold in cash terms and more than fourfold as a proportion of the total benefits budget. This wasn't some kind of act of God. This was the result of serial failures by the party opposite. They failed to understand that fraud was evolving and modernise the powers of DWP so they could keep up in the arms race with the fraudsters, and they made some truly terrible policy and design choices that actively fueled the fraud crisis. This can be seen nowhere better than in the way they set up the universal credit. Because of their failures in making sure its gateway was properly established and policed, it became a magnet for fraud. Universal credit accounts for just 22% of benefit spending, but contributes over 76% of all benefits frauds. Almost £1 in £9 claimed under them through the UC in their last year in power was claimed fraudulently, compared with just £1 in £25 for housing benefit, £1 in £300 for PIP, and just £1 in £1,000 for pensions. The reality is that the party opposite failed to take the threat of fraud seriously and failed to understand how it was professionalising and industrialising, as the story I told earlier showed, and left us all to pick up the bill. They say they acted, but the truth is they did nothing for years. And then even when they finally got their act together, at the very end of their term in office, it was a case of too little, too late. The reality is that once again, we are having to step in to clear up their mess. They owe everyone in this House and everyone in the country an apology. And it is striking that in all their bluster today, during this debate, we haven't heard the only word they should be uttering. Sorry. Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, fraud exploded on their watch and because of their failings. But the pattern of fraud also tells us a lot about why the powers that this bill outlines are so desperately needed. DWP's own statistics show that of the £7.4 billion lost in fraud last year, around £1 billion was lost to people who held too much capital to be eligible. £1.3 billion was lost to those who had failed to report their self-employment earnings, and a further £1.3 billion was lost to those who have failed to provide sufficient evidence. A further £250 million was lost to those who were abroad. These frauds could have been caught with better data and better investigatory powers. It would have been possible for banks to spot people with too much capital to claim or those with considerable earnings. Yet today, because of the failure of the last government to update their legislation, DWP cannot compel information digitally. Virtually all banking is now online and fraud is propagating through digital channels and moving at lightning speed, and yet DWP is still forced to rely on analogue tools. In other fields, we already integrate information and get institutions to work together to prevent fraud. Banks regularly scan patterns that indicate fraud. Benefits should be no different. We need digital tools and access to digital data to fight fraud. And like tax, investigators should have the powers they need to recover funds from those no longer on benefits. That is why the powers that the Secretary of State is proposing to take are so important. They allow us to better identify those committing fraud, and they allow us to take more effective recovery action to get taxpayer money back. But they will also allow us to do another thing, Madam Deputy Speaker. And this brings me to the second story I started my speech with. These measures, along with the measures the Chancellor brought forward in the budget, will help us protect legitimate claimants by helping pick up overpayments earlier. 480,000 people last year had deductions averaging £500 taken from their universal credit payments because of overpayments. This can be a source of huge anxiety and hardship. Preventing these overpayments and catching them earlier will help protect the most vulnerable claimants. And it will only be possible because of the better data and the better processes that this bill will help support. Now, I know, Madam Deputy Speaker, that some have voiced concerns about the powers proposed in this bill and whether they will impinge on people's rights, as we just heard from the previous speaker. But I am strongly reassured by the powerful raft of safeguards that the Secretary of State has included in this bill. Safeguards that mean new debt recovery powers will be focused not on those on benefits, but rather on those who are neither on benefits or PAYE. Safeguards that mean DWP will not have access to people's bank accounts, contrary to what some during this debate have implied. Safeguards that will include independent oversight and options for appeal. And I am pleased to hear that on top of that, the ICO believes that these safeguards address the concerns that they had with the proposals of the party opposite. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a fair and balanced package, a package that modernises our approach, gives us the digital tools to fight a digital scourge, and the enforcement powers to take on organised crime while protecting the vulnerable. This government and this ministerial team is modernising our system to protect public money, help the vulnerable, and critically, get Britain working. And I am proud to support it.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to comment on a number of different speeches that have been made and talk about the issues that the SNP has with this bill. It won't be a surprise to anyone that we've got issues with this bill since we've put in a reasoned amendment that unfortunately didn't get selected today, but we have got a number of significant problems. But first I just want to mention part one of the bill, which relates to particularly the COVID monies being recovered and the additional money that was, or the services that should have arrived and the goods that should have arrived with government that were substandard, and organisations need to pay back government for that. Given the scope of that does not extend to Scotland, I won't add much in the way of comments on it, except to note that I've got a long track record of bringing up the COVID frauds, the PPE frauds particularly, in this chamber, and I will support the work that the government intends to do to recoup that money that was fraudulently taken in government contracts that then did not deliver. So my comments in relation to the bill relate particularly to the DWP areas in the bill, and my opposition to the bill is on the basis of those parts of the bill. I just wanted to make that quite clear. This is not what we should be talking about when we're talking about social security. As my friend from Brighton Pavilion said, from the Green Party, the social security system should be built on dignity and respect. And other than a couple of people here, we've had very few people talking about how we should have a social security system that works. We've heard people talking about tightening up eligibility criteria. We've heard people talking about, last week, the number of scroungers that there are, or people that are not in work, that are claiming social security benefits, and how desperate it is that we get them back to work. Absolutely, it's really good that people should have opportunities. But it's also really important that we should have a social security system that catches people, that provides people with a level of support when they can't access those opportunities, when they're not currently able to, when they're struggling with their health, when they're struggling with their physical health, with their mental health, when they've got learning difficulties. We need to have that social security system that works. And I've asked the Minister on a couple of occasions, and one of the members also mentioned the theory of co-production and the idea of co-production. Now, when it comes to changes to disability benefits, for example, I think co-production is where the government needs to get to on this. If the government is going to reduce the numbers the amount of money that's being paid out when it comes to disability and sickness benefits, they need to do that hand in hand with disabled people. Not just say, we are going to reduce it by this amount. They need to be sitting round the table, allowing disabled people to have those conversations and to make clear what changes it is that they want to see. And in Scotland, we have reformed the previous PIP system to adult disability payment and child disability payment. The number of emails and contacts and people walking through my door that I used to get who were terrified about their PIP assessment coming up, who were terrified about having to fill in those forms again, who were horrified at the thought that they would have to sit and write a long thing about how many things their child cannot do, how many normal things their child can't do on an annual basis. And now we've changed that. We've changed that in Scotland so that we don't have those regular assessments, so that if somebody's got a longer term condition, that they don't have to go through that on an annual basis. They don't have to go through that awful situation. Now, the government needs to be focusing on that dignity and respect. They need to be focusing on that co-production. That should be way ahead of conversations around fraud. Now, it's important. It's important that the social security system, it's important that the procurement system, for example, don't propagate fraud. It's important that the tax system doesn't propagate fraud. As has been mentioned a number of times around the chamber, the tax system creates a huge amount more fraud with a huge amount more that could be recouped than the social security system. I have got major concerns about the way that the government is approaching this. Why are they bringing the fraud bill before the child poverty strategy? Why are they bringing the fraud bill? Why is this more of a priority than cancelling the two-child cap and taking kids out of poverty? Why is this coming first? Why is the £10 billion a year that's being talked about, the nearly £10 billion that there is in money owed to the DWP being talked about? Now, just to be clear, that's not what the government's intending to recoup. If you look at the impact assessment, at least 30% of that will just be written off. Right? So £10 billion is a really misleading figure. It's not the figure they're expecting to get back. It might be the total figure that is sitting there in terms of fraud, in terms of error, but it's not what's actually coming back to the government. It doesn't take into account the fact that they're going to be spending £420 million over the next few years just in increasing the number of people staffing and the costs that there are around the eligibility criteria. It doesn't take into account the fact that that's not a net figure. That is just the headline figure right now. So all of this legislation, all of this work that's being done is to recoup a fairly insignificant amount of money. It's going to put people through absolute hell. It's going to, as has been said, treat people as guilty rather than suggest that they begin from the point of view of being innocent. It's going to put every one of those people that's applying for benefits potentially through an eligibility check, through their bank. It is going to have them surveyed and under surveillance in a way that is not compatible with the human rights that we should all be expecting and experiencing. And remember, we're talking about people who are, in some cases, incredibly vulnerable. If we get to the point where somebody has got getting their driving licence taken away, for example, now the member for Normanton and Hemsworth talked about two of his constituents who found themselves in a really difficult situation and who functionally did not have a huge amount of literacy, right? Now, it's possible that one of those people could have had a driving licence. Now, for disabled people, your car can be an absolute lifeline. It can be the most important thing. For people with mental health problems, for example, opening letters can be really, really difficult. People could be not engaging with the DWP through absolutely no fault of their own. They could be not engaging with the DWP because they're not getting the mental health support that they should be getting. Now, that £10 billion, or however much is actually going to be recouped, is not going to fix mental health services to ensure that everybody is capable of getting up in the morning, having their breakfast, having a shower and opening the letters that in scary, big writing that have come through the door. It's not going to ensure that people are able to engage in that system. It's not going to teach them to read and write. Sometimes they may not be capable of that. So I share the concerns of other members that there are some individuals for whom these powers, the powers of recouping, the powers of the driving licence revocation, for example, are wholly and entirely inappropriate, and I don't believe that we've had enough reassurances on this. My concerns around the Information Commissioner are still excellent. I believe and appreciate that the Minister has made clear that she's had a letter from the Information Commissioner. I'm really disappointed, and I understand it's probably not the Secretary of State's fault, that we have not seen that letter in advance of today. I'm being told that it's being published or being published. It's on the ICO website, but I have unfortunately not seen it because I was not aware of its publication until the Secretary of State stood on her feet. It would have been really helpful for members to be given that information beforehand so that we could read the Information Commissioner's comments in advance of the second reading, given a number of us have mentioned it, given a number of us have mentioned the significant concerns that were brought up by the Information Commissioner in relation to the last bill on this. The Secretary of State said this bill is tough and it's fair. And one of the other members said, the other members were talking about some of the tax fraud and some of the benefit fraud. One of the members spoke about the issue that there is with the DWP making overpayments. In fact, a number of people have mentioned this, and they've suggested that this new system will ensure that overpayments are reduced. Will ensure that overpayments are caught earlier. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would suggest that's just a tad over-optimistic. The DWP make mistakes and make overpayments. So now we're giving them another place in which they can make mistakes, another place in which they can make errors. So they can now see into people's bank accounts and say, oh, you don't meet the eligibility criteria, so you won't be getting the social security payment. I would suggest that until we've built up much higher level of trust than there currently is with the DWP, most people will assume that these powers will create more errors in the system rather than reduce the number of errors that there are in the system. And just lastly, around disabled people that I mentioned earlier, and around that trust issue, there is no trust from a massive number of disabled people when it comes to the social security system. They are massively concerned about the cuts that are coming down the line. They're massively concerned that they are going to be the brunt of those cuts, given the comments that are being made from so many politicians using the word scroungers, talking about the fact that people are fraudulently claiming benefits, talking about the fact, and disabled people, despite the fact that the member very helpfully laid out the percentage or the numbers in every pound that are claimed fraudulently, which I genuinely thought was very helpful, disabled people feel like they're being lumped in with that entire grouping, and whether they can or can't work, whether they're being paid universal credit or PIP in order to assist them with their work, whether they've got a helpful employer or haven't been able to find a helpful employer, feel that they're being demonised by politicians simply for claiming social security, which they are entitled to. Until that trust is rebuilt, making a decision like this today to look at their bank accounts is the absolute wrong decision. I think the government needs to do what it can to put dignity and respect at the heart of the social security system, to rebuild that trust in the security system before they take these sweeping, disproportionate powers. And in fact, I think the member from Brighton Pavilion it was that mentioned the fact that there are so many unclaimed benefits. Surely making sure that people have got the money that they're entitled to would be more of a priority for the government. And surely making sure that people have got enough to live on should be more of a priority for the government. Surely reducing child poverty and ensuring that not one child grows up in poverty should be more of a priority for the government than bringing in eligibility criteria and demanding that banks provide financial information on social security claimants.
Zara Sultana.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wish to focus on the powers outlined in this bill that force banks to trawl through our private financial data, scanning for indicators of fraud and error, indicators that are not publicly disclosed, and flag those individuals to the government. These powers allow the Department for Work and Pensions to seize money directly from bank accounts without due process, suspend driving licences and even search properties and personal devices. These are not the hallmarks of a free and democratic society, but the tools of an Orwellian surveillance state. Let me be clear, we all agree that genuine fraudsters should be held to account, especially multimillionaire tax avoiders, organised criminal gangs and dodgy companies who exploited COVID funding. But the bill in its current form goes far beyond that. It subjects millions of innocent people, disabled individuals, carers, job seekers, pensioners and parents to unwarranted financial surveillance. It treats them as suspects by default simply because they receive state support. This is deeply unjust. The government already has extensive powers to investigate suspected fraud. Under existing legislation, it can access bank accounts where there is reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. But this bill removes the need for suspicion altogether. Put simply, this is mass surveillance. Madam Deputy Speaker, there are significant risks. We have already seen the devastating consequences of automated decision-making in the Post Office Horizon scandal, where faulty software led to hundreds of wrongful prosecutions. This bill risks repeating that injustice on an unprecedented scale, and we shouldn't have to wait for an ITV drama to expose that in the future. The DWP has already made mistakes in accusing benefit claimants of debt. As reported in The Big Issue, in July last year, a disabled woman had her disability benefit stopped and she was accused of owing the government £28,000, which the DWP later admitted was their mistake. A single mother was accused of a £12,000 debt when the DWP actually owed her money. Algorithm-driven financial surveillance will inevitably result in errors disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable in our society, the elderly, the disabled, and those already struggling to make ends meet. Even a 1% error rate in the AI system used by banks could lead to thousands of benefit recipients being wrongly flagged, unfairly investigated, and forced into lengthy appeals. Moreover, the government's own impact assessment suggests that these measures would recover just £146 million annually, less than 2% of the estimated annual loss to fraud and error. In contrast, £23 billion in benefits and support goes unclaimed each year, and £3 billion in claims are underpaid. Yet this bill does absolutely nothing to address those injustices or build a security system based on dignity and respect. Instead, it targets those who can least afford to be wrongly flagged as fraudsters. Madam Deputy Speaker, this legislation represents a rushed process with little scrutiny. At 116 pages long, the bill was scheduled for a second reading just 7 working days after its first reading. Therefore, an attempt to push through mass surveillance powers with minimal debate, bypassing necessary checks and balances that should apply to any policy, especially one that affects millions of people's fundamental rights. These powers are also legally questionable, with privacy experts warning that they could breach Article 8 of the Human Rights Act. Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill risks creating a two-tiered justice system, one for the very wealthy who will never face this kind of intrusion, and another for those on benefits who will be subject to constant scrutiny, automated checks, and the threat of their money being seized, thus perpetuating harmful stereotypes about so-called benefit cheats, and therefore also distracting attention away from millions of households that are legitimately supported by a social security system that exists to support every single one of us when we need it. Civil society groups including Amnesty International, Big Brother Watch, Disability Rights UK and Age UK have all condemned these powers, warning they will entrench discrimination against the poorest and the most vulnerable. Madam Deputy Speaker, we cannot allow this to happen. We cannot allow the government to turn our banks into agents of the state, spying on their own customers and reporting back to Whitehall. And we cannot allow the presumption of innocence to be eroded by a culture of suspicion and surveillance. Nor can we stand idly by while the most vulnerable in our communities bear the brunt of this overreach. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is not the change people voted for. Therefore, I urge the government to remove Clause 74 and Schedule 3 of this bill. Thank you.
Jim Allister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. None of us, I hope, have any empathy with fraudsters. I trust that it is the united view of this House that fraud, wherever it occurs, should be pursued with rigour. But that does not mean that a bill which proclaims itself as having that purpose is one that we should simply gnawed through. The fine print of that bill deserves equally rigorous examination. And when I come to this bill, there are a number of areas that I find concerning. I find the equivalence in terms of investigative powers and the initiation of them between investigating fraud and investigating overpayment troubling, because there is a huge difference between a person who enriches themselves by fraudulent activity and someone who is innocent but is the recipient of an overpayment, not because of a mistake they've made, but because of a mistake that the department has made. That is a huge distinction, morally and every other way. And yet within this bill, it seems to me, there is an equivalence when it comes to the powers of investigation in that regard. And that I find discomforting and unfair. I also find it surprising in some of the detail that we find in this bill. As our law presently stands, someone can only, in the eyes of the law, be regarded and held to be a fraudster if they've been convicted beyond all reasonable doubt of fraud. That is the hallowed, long-standing criminal standard which has to be reached before someone is convicted as a fraudster. But no longer is that the standard when we come to this bill. Indeed, no longer is it for the courts to decide if someone is a fraudster. Now, under Clause 50 of this bill, the Minister can decide if someone's a fraudster and can decide it not on the criminal standard, but on the balance of probabilities. Look what Clause 50 says. The Minister may impose a penalty on a person if satisfied on the balance of probabilities that the person has carried out or conspired to carry out fraud. So the Minister, on the balance of probabilities, not our courts, the Minister decides that someone is a fraudster. Now, how could that be right? How could that be fair? And it gets worse, because when you read Clause 50 with Clause 52, you discover that the penalty is measured in terms not of what the fraud was in every case, but what the fraud might have been. So you can be penalised on the balance of probabilities, not by a court, but by a minister, not for having obtained anything fraudulently, but what you might have obtained if the fraud had been perfected. I do say to this House, that is taking us far too far. And I do think that that is something that needs to be re-examined. And then I come to Clause 91. This astounding provision, this disconnected provision, that you can be disqualified from driving if you have failed to pay back £1,000 of money, whether you got it by fraud or, as I read this, whether you were overpaid it. You can lose your driving licence. And you can lose your driving licence not because you've been convicted of fraud, because when you read 91.2, it says that the schedule that's now being amended will make provision for a liable person to be disqualified. What's a liable person? Well, we have to go to Clause 11, and when we go to Clause 11, we discovered a liable person is somebody that the minister serves a recovery notice on. So if the minister serves a recovery notice on you, that makes you a liable person under 91, and under 91, if you still haven't paid back £1,000, you can lose your driving licence. Really, I do think that in that measure, we have hugely run away with ourselves in terms of what is proportionate and in terms of what is appropriate. And I do say to the government, there is much here that they need to re-examine in terms of the overreach of this bill. Yes, let's go after fraudsters. Yes, let's recover the money that they should never have had. But let's do it in a way that respects the traditions of our legal system and of the decency in our society, instead of the overreach of some, not all, of some aspects of this bill. Now, this bill does not apply to the area I come from, Northern Ireland. But inevitably, because parity controls the welfare payments that are made in Northern Ireland, there will be parallel, eventually, some reflective legislation of this nature. And that would be needed. Because I do want to say a word, and I want the Minister to take this on board, about the Northern Ireland Executive. The welfare payments in Northern Ireland are demand-led. They're administered by the Northern Ireland Executive, by the Department of Communities. But they are demand-led. And therefore, in that sense, they are not coming out of the Northern Ireland Block Grant. And therefore, it seems to me, there is a tendency within the Northern Ireland Executive to be less rigorous than they ought to be on fraud. Because they're not recovering money which would be money misused from the Northern Ireland Block Grant. They are recovering money from the Treasury that was misused. And that, for some of them, shamefully, does seem to create a disincentive to pursuing fraud recovery with the vigour that they should. And I say that on the basis that figures released in a number of Northern Ireland Assembly answers show that in the last 5 years, there have only been between 200 and 300 fraud pursuit cases in Northern Ireland, and only touching upon £4.5 million. There's a lot more fraud than £4.5 million in the benefit system in Northern Ireland. So I do say to the Minister, when it comes to this question of fraud, yes, let's pursue it with vigour and let her put some pressure on the Northern Ireland Executive to make sure that they are living up to their obligations to also save the Treasury the money that has been lost in fraud. Thank you very much.
Sally Jameson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill sets out a clear agenda that this government will be tough on fraud, it will ensure fairness for benefit claimants, and it will offer confidence to the taxpayer. When it comes to taxpayers' money, fraud and waste cannot and must not be tolerated. And I am pleased that this government is taking this approach, and I am proud to speak in favour of the bill today. I was frankly appalled to learn that a total of £35 billion of taxpayers' money has been lost to fraud and error since the pandemic. And I think of my constituents in Doncaster Central, how desperately we need refurbishments to our hospital, how many children live below the poverty line, and how many of my constituents are stuck on NHS waiting lists. And I am pretty outraged at just how much money, which could have helped solve these problems, was instead drained by fraudsters, sometimes on a large and organised scale, and the careless error of the last government. With these measures, the government will protect claimants by preventing errors earlier. It will ensure that our benefit system works for those who claim benefits they so desperately need, and it will give taxpayers the right to see their hard-earned money spent well. I welcome that this government is bringing the department's search and seizure powers in line with those of HMRC and child maintenance, and I am pleased to see the department's commitment to ensuring strong safeguards on those powers, including the appointment of an independent body to conduct independent inspections on the department's investigations. We must ensure that the tough measures we introduce to recoup taxpayers' money are met with equally tough scrutiny and safeguards. I hope that this will remain a priority as the bill progresses through stages of this House. I have no doubt that some members opposite will and have claimed that they introduced measures to crack down on benefit fraud, and indeed they did eventually. At the very tail end of the last Parliament, they tagged measures on to the end of another bill which never passed, and it has fallen to us, as it has in many other areas, to take the necessary action. And whether it's benefit fraud or fraudulent COVID contracts, these are not victimless crimes. It is public services and our constituents that lose out. We need to get on with this job. We cannot afford to lose more public money, which our constituents pay for with their taxes and should feel the benefit of. Tough measures, tough sanctions and tough safeguards are the key to ensuring our welfare system is fair for its genuine claimants and robust enough to ensure taxpayer money goes where it is supposed to go, to the people and services who need it most.
Jim Shannon.
Madam Deputy Speaker. First of all, can I make the comment and clear for the record? It is, in my opinion, important that government pursues where fraud is. And the question to the Secretary of State today, in questions I asked her about pursuing, and the example was in the paper today, and I think it might have been in the Sunday paper yesterday, was about a gentleman who had defrauded the system of, I think it was probably about £800,000, had skipped off to Romania, I think it was, and we didn't have a system or treaty where we could then pursue him, but obviously government would wish to ensure that all those monies are recoverable. The point I'm making is there clearly are those who set out to defraud the system, and it's important that government responds in a positive way, and government, I think, are doing that. But I do have to put on record some concerns I have. When we speak to constituents on the door, none have an issue with those who are in need of help from the state, none who are ill, out of work for genuine reasons, but there is with some, and rightly so, a definite feeling of those who claim and work on the side. Therefore, I agree that we need to clamp down on those who are, who are doing the double. That's a terminology that's maybe not used very often, but it's very clear what happens. The stats perhaps indicate that there may well be an issue, although the scale referred to in government documentation greatly varies from the National Audit Office putting the amount in the range between 5 billion and 30 billion in 23-24 across the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It is clear that we need to do something effective, as those who work hard and are barely making ends meet are crying out for fairness. However, my fear, and I have to put this on record, my fear is that we open up powers that can't be removed and which do turn us into a nanny state. In the earlier intervention on the Secretary of State, I had expressed concern over those who make genuine and honest mistakes. The Honourable Member for Northampton referred to it in a very, very polished and qualified way. Those who fill in forms and all judgment, doing the thing correctly as they would feel, and perhaps make a mistake and tick the wrong box. It happens all the time. I would send to my honourable friend for East Antrim, has he done many of them over the years? I've done probably about 30, maybe 40 of those over the years. Every one genuine, Madam Deputy Speaker. Every one a mistake. Every one, unfortunately, they ticked the wrong box and they found themselves in a position where they had to repay the money. So I understand where the issues are. I am concerned over those who are disabled, those who are anxious, those who are depressed, those who have emotional issues, mental issues, who have disabled issues as well, and that they don't become, and I use the terminology, the low-lying fruit for government ministers and department to pursue, instead of pursuing those who are guilty of some real asset, like that person I mentioned earlier on, asset for the benefits that they've almost claimed were this side of £1 million. So it is important that the disabled, the anxious, the depressed, that those are not pursued. The girl in my office, she's a staff member, she works full-time on benefits, does it 5 days a week. Our diary is full from 9 o'clock in the morning right through to 5 o'clock every day of the week. I see those people come to my office. You know who they are? They're disabled. They're the people with the genuine causes. They're the people, Madam Deputy Speaker, who have applied for benefits and are anxious, maybe a bit worried about the whole thing. But I always say to them, and the girls say to them as well, they always say, well, you know, if you're going to get it, and it's right to get it, then put down the facts on your application paper and the department will make a decision. Those are the people I fear for. Those are the people I worry for. Those are the people that I have anxiety myself on their behalf for what could happen to them. And whenever they genuinely apply for that, the DWP do make mistakes. Those 30 odd that I referred to that I've been involved with over the years, every one of them was successful because there was a genuine mistake. Now, the fear I have, and I have to say, guys, I respect this greatly, and I understand the principle of what you're trying to do. That's never in doubt about where I'm coming from. But whenever we look at honourable members, sorry, apologies for that, the Madam Deputy Speaker, when it comes to the penalisation with removing the driving licence, for maybe £1,000, as the honourable member for Northampton referred to, that they could have maybe not have been, should have been in receipt of. The point I'm making is this: if you take away their driving licence for that something that they made a mistake on, and you penalise them and then make them guilty, and then they cannot attend their job because they haven't got a car or do their work, which they have to pay that money back, then I think it's overkill. So I do have some concerns about that, and I'm quite concerned. I want to make a comment, if I can, as well in relation to bank accounts. So I'm going to use examples. Everything I do in this House, Madam Deputy Speaker, will become out of Strangford. And there won't be any surprise to anybody that my examples will be Strangford-based. My contributions will be Strangford-based to help all the people here, the other members who make contributions. I was contacted by a constituent whose brother has been diagnosed with paranoid psychosis. He was living in a tent when the sister realised he'd been put out of his apartment and his benefits had fallen to the wayside. She took control, got him on benefits, situated in a private rented apartment, and says he doesn't trust banks because that's all part of the health issue that he has. All of this is done through her accounts. Without her, he wouldn't be able to pay rent or do anything, as he doesn't trust government, and she handles it all. Will his sister, have her bank accounts open for government scrutiny? Will she hand over care to the social worker who ceased contact because her brother wouldn't engage and signed him off as too difficult to work with? That's all part of the paranoid psychosis, the health problems, the issues, the disabilities, the emotional issues, the mental issues that they face. I think of those people. I always, Madam Deputy Speaker, will speak up for the wee man and the wee woman who are penalised through a system which tries hard to achieve the goals that it sets out to, but unfortunately it falls by the wayside. Who will take care of that if she objects to government rifling through her accounts when she works hard and pays more than her share in tax? And the honourable gentleman on the far side, I can't remember who it was, escaped my mind, but he mentioned about the HMRC and pursuing the monies which they should be pursuing there with the same zealousness as they are in this case. What security will she have to ensure that her privacy is not sacrificed due to helping her brother? And more importantly, how many others like her, friends and family members of those suffering from mental health, will pull back because of it? I'd ask the Minister for insurance in these cases, and that's what I asked for earlier on. I think it's really important that each and every one of us who has I'm not saying nobody else has a conscience, by the way, I don't mean that. Those of us who have concerns on behalf of our constituents in relation to them. A government overreach for those who are caring for the mentally ill, who already live a life of stress down to their caring duties, without recompense from government because they already work, could see more pressure on the state to fill the breach. So I respectively say, I just don't see how we have the capacity for this. I never want, Madam Deputy, I never want to see a scenario whereby genuinely disabled people are so concerned about the scope of government regulation into their monies that they don't claim for what they're entitled to. Would that be a terrible situation where government has set a system aside, whether it be PIPs, whether it be universal credit, whether it be DLA, whether it be pension credit, attendance allowance, all those benefits which are there for a purpose. I always say to everybody when they come to me, I says, government has set this aside for you. It's yours if you qualify and the criteria is there. People who save for a holiday, I mean, where does it end? People who save for a holiday, perhaps, whose partner works and takes them on a holiday tailored to their needs. It might be up to the hotel in Portrush. It might be that far away. It could be to Jersey on a plane with a wheelchair and disabled assistants to get on the plane and off. But those are the things you don't want to see people getting penalised for whenever their disability is such that they can only do that if there's somebody with them. They're afraid to go for fear of being labelled a benefit cheat. But by the same time, those who are doing the double, as it used to be known, should be unable to continue this life at the expense of the taxpayer. So my question to the Minister is this: how does government intend to find the balance? I'm keen, Madam Deputy, to get the balance. I think the balance is so critical. Understand the urge to do it, and it's right to do it. But I don't want to see those who are justified in having their benefit being penalised by it. I know that government believe that they could reclaim some 54 million in 10 years. If that is a figure, then it's worth pursuing. But how much will this cost to run over that same year? How much will it cost government to chase all these monies? And how do we send a message to those who are concerned over their loss of freedom to a government who can look into family bank accounts? That this is a measure worth taking. So my final comment, Madam Deputy Speaker, is this: do the job that you've set yourself out to do, but make sure you don't chase the wee man and the wee woman, people who I represent, people who the Honourable Gentleman represents, people that we all represent in this chamber, both sides. Those are the people I'm speaking up for tonight, and I want to make sure that they're protected. Thank you.
John McDonnell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I don't want to repeat what's been put by others, but I just want to put my own perspective on this. I think what we've seen is the bill in two parts, and there's almost unanimity about the first part of the bill with regard to how we tackle fraud through contracts, etc. Although I want to thank the member for North Antrim, who actually, I just want to thank the member for North Antrim for actually pointing out some of the elements of real concern in that section of the bill, which, to be frank, I missed. The bill's only been published a week, and it's been difficult to go through, and I've been somewhat distracted by the government trying to concrete over a quarter of my constituency with a third runway. But it's interesting that element of it needs further examination, because I think it will be challenged, to be frank, legally in some form. But on that element of the bill, that first half of the bill of tackling overall fraud, I can't welcome it enough. I was the first MP to raise with the Chancellor what was happening with regard to the COVID bounce-back grants and loans and the corruption that was taking place there. I raised it a number of times in the House, and I wrote to him twice, and I got back a standard letter that was almost identical to the response I got from the banks as well, that they were going through their usual investigatory process, etc. And then we discovered later than that, eventually, it was at least 5 billion, if I remember the figure right, with regard to the bounce back loans. So I welcome all that. We need to be ruthless on the corruption and fraud that takes place there. But the second part of the bill, particularly Clause 74 and Schedule 3, I think is where we're straining, to be frank. And partly for me, it's this context. Some people have mentioned it already. There's real fear out there amongst people who claim welfare benefits, and in particular disabled people who claim welfare benefits. And it's as a result of successive targeting of them, and it's as a result of, I think, careless language in this place and by others that is then exaggerated even further by the media, and they then become targets. And I want to echo what the member for Strangford has said as well. In my constituency, I have the same problem as him. Sometimes it's telling people to claim what they're entitled to because they're terrified of the stigma of claiming benefits at the moment, particularly amongst the older people. And the atmosphere that we now have, I think, is a climate of fear. And I'm worried that this debate is going to add to that climate of fear. What the Secretary of State said was that any proposal had to be proportionate, safe and fair. I think there's real concerns about the proportionality of this. As others have said, this is a step towards, well, it is a mass surveillance exercise. And the problem I have with it is that it's that phrase, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I fear that once you start down this path of surveillance in this way, then others will come back with further proposals where we go further. And the issue with regard to safety, well, people have said it time and time again in this debate so far. How many lessons do we have to learn about the way computer systems, the use of algorithms have actually destroyed people's lives? And what will happen here? My honourable friend said about the banks gearing up. I think the banks are expressing their concern that this is almost an exercise beyond their abilities. And as a result of that, there will be errors, and that will reinforce the climate of fear that people have around benefits. So I'm interested in... certainly.
I apologise for omitting this from my speech, but does the honourable gentleman feel that there is a decision by government here to penalise those who have taken or been charged with alleged fraud? Does he feel there should be an appeal system in place so that they can appeal that system?
That's why I think the code of practice is going to be interesting. We need to have the code of practice published as rapidly as possible to see what mechanisms will be available for us to protect our constituents. The one area of experience that I have got with regard to the flagging up of sums of money within bank accounts that express concern, it was around the tax debates that we had around tax avoidance, and that was the suspicious activity reports, if people can remember when they were introduced. There has been a record of where there have been real faults in that process and a high number of errors, and as a result of that, people have not just been penalised, but also have penalised unfairly, but also been exposed unfairly as well. Not that I'm in any way a defender of tax avoidance or anything like that, but if we're going to introduce a system, we need to make sure it's secure and effective and doesn't penalise people unfairly. The other issue, the third, was proportionate, safe and fair. The reason people, I think, will feel this is unfair is because it is very specifically targeting people who are often in desperate need. Do you know, if there was a group of people that you'd want to monitor their accounts of, where there's been a history of fraud, where they've had to pay money back, and where some have gone to prison, it would be MPs. Because I was here when this Spencer scandal went on. So are we really, as a result of that experience, not monitoring our accounts for undue payments, etc.? Why is it always the poor that we target in this way? So I just finally say this. I am really worried, as I said, about the climate of fear there is, particularly amongst people with disabilities. The honourable gentleman from the Liberal Dem front bench mentioned it. We've had 600 suicides that we know about that are related to DWP activity. If you look at John Pring's book, we circulated it to all MPs about the DWP's role in those deaths. And it was, I think, starkly obvious that the DWP had made a significant contribution, if not in causing those deaths. I can remember the case in Scotland where it was a poet in Leith who committed suicide, but he didn't leave a suicide note, he just left the DWP letter beside him. And again, my view is whatever steps we take in this exercise of these powers, we have to be extremely careful. So one of the things I want to try and raise, is, and I might try and, if I can, crowbar it into this legislation with an amendment, I will, is that a number of us, on the basis of the work that some of you will know, Mo Stewart, the researcher into poverty and welfare benefits, has put forward, is that actually to protect people, to give them the assurance that they'll be protected, that we do everything we can to do no harm, to cause no harm, and certainly not to cause any further suicides, but also to learn the lessons of that, of what's happened in the past. So one of the proposals is from Mo Stewart, is for an independent advisory panel for DWP-related deaths. We have exactly that system in place for deaths in custody. We have an advisory system at the moment for the DWP, but to be frank, it's not working. The minutes of their meetings are cursory. They don't do the detailed reports in the same way the Deaths in Custody panel does. And I think if we are going to reassure people out there, we really are looking after their interests. I think that's one small step that we could include in this legislation to give that assurance. I'm not sure whether we'll be able to crowbar it in within the title of the bill, but I'll do my best and would welcome the creative drafting of others to help me on this. But I think it would just send out the right message. I think the Secretary of State has tried to do that tonight with assurances around the processes. I'm not sure if that will be enough, though, given the climate of fear that we now have. The next steps, I'm hoping there will be sufficient time now during the committee stage for us all to get our heads around this detail of the bill itself. I'm hoping there would be more consultation, and it would be better to delay the report stage of the bill to enable that consultation. And I want to raise the issue that's been raised by the Honourable Member from the Green Party. We were giving assurances at one point whereby these developments, proposals in this, would be done by co-production rather than just announcement and being passed down from above. I think this would be a good example of good governance if there was a process of proper consultation, following what we saw in Ellen Clifford's case in the High Court, where the High Court ruled in favour against the government in terms of the past government's consultation, but there was a spirit then of the response from the government that there would be proper consultation, and it would be on the basis, I hope, of the principle of nothing about us without us. And I think the passage of this bill, the consultation around the detail of it, would be the best example the government could give of that process working productively, so we get it right and we don't endanger any further people, as unfortunately has happened in the past.
John Milne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure I speak for all honourable members when I say that putting a stop to fraud of any kind is welcome, especially at a time when public money is scarce. However, many of my Horsham constituents have contacted me to say that the powers outlined in this bill are very far-reaching and, if abused, could have hugely detrimental effects on benefit claimants through no fault of their own. As mentioned by my colleague, the Honourable Member for Torbay, the carers' repayment scandal shows exactly what can go wrong when the state has high-level powers over debt recovery. Due to departmental error, not the claimants, over 250,000 cases of overpayments to carers occurred in the last 5 years of the Conservative government. That's an enormous number. What would have happened to these carers, who are paid very little in respect of the huge service to society they provide, if these powers that are now to be put in place had been in place during those 5 years? They would likely have faced forced withdrawals from their bank accounts, possible removal of their driving licences, or even forced entry to their homes by the DWP. The bill gives increased powers to access private bank accounts, and this requires careful consideration from a civil liberties perspective. However, the DWP already has the power to compel third parties to share data where criminal activity is suspected. The new powers would appear to reduce the need for prior evidence and simply grant access at will. Given that access to banking information is estimated to recover just 1.4% of the government's annual loss to fraud and error, do these powers of forced withdrawals represent a proportionate action? it might make more sense for the government to increase the efficacy of existing requirements on third parties to report suspicious activity, and for HMRC to share banking data on an annual basis before introducing new powers. The government has asserted that this bill will save the public purse £1.5 billion. But in the absence of an impact statement, how do we know this? If the DWP is to have the power to take people's money, suspend driving licences and enter their homes, we should at least be very confident that it's worth it. In particular, we need to be sure that these predicted savings don't come from the blameless victims of departmental error, as has happened previously with the carers' overpayment scandal. While it's of huge importance that fraud be reduced, until we're sure that we've learned the lessons of the past, we run the risk of damaging people's lives for insufficient benefit. We're at risk of making the same mistakes again, but with fewer checks and balances. This bill is welcome in its sentiment, but there are risks attached. I am concerned that it builds a narrative that assumes that the claimant is the guilty party when it could be the department that's at fault. So I therefore call on the government to apply all possible care before launching new regulations, which at present amount to a matter of trial and error. Thank you.
Paula Barker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Whilst I recognise fraud exists across the public sector, and it is wholly right for any government to track down fraudsters, criminal gangs and those who cheat the system, at the bottom as well as the top, as we have heard about the VIP fast lane, I do hold deep reservations about the unintended consequences of this bill as it stands. And I think tonight we have heard some very constructive contributions from members across this House. I would like to start by thanking my Right Honourable friend, the Secretary of State, who is always accessible and has been willing to listen to my concerns, and those shared by many of my constituents who have got in touch to express their views. While she has allayed some of my fears, I did let her know that I would be raising my concerns in the chamber today. First, there needs to be a greater distinction made between fraud and error in the bill. Members cannot accept a situation where our constituents are being accused of fraud on the back of genuine personal errors. I know firsthand from my own experience as a constituency MP, the department is more than capable of making glaring errors of their own, and people suffer greatly on the back of them. The welfare system is not an easy one to navigate, and people should be supported when problems arise, rather than there being a natural presumption towards guilt. Many organisations that have been in touch with members share this fear, so I think it's essential the government addresses the point head on. Madam Deputy Speaker, other aspects of this bill still sit very uneasy with me. The government already has the powers under existing legislation to investigate those suspected of fraud. So it does pose the question why this piece of legislation is needed. It does feel like a hammer to crack a nut. After the Second World War, the Whately government set about establishing a welfare state that was a safety net for those genuinely in need. The Whately government took responsibility for looking after the well-being of all its citizens from the cradle to the grave. Worryingly, there now seems to be a determination to transform the British welfare state into a system of mass surveillance. So I would be grateful if the Minister would respond to the following points in their summing up. What provisions are being made in respect of proper oversight of these proposed new powers, although I do acknowledge that the Secretary of State has spoken at the dispatch box about some of this. How does any financial institution navigate data protection conflicts between government and its customers? How would data security risks be mitigated? During the previous iteration of this bill, tabled by the last government, the Equality and Human Rights Commission called for it to be scrapped, Madam Deputy Speaker. Legal opinion from Dan Squires KC and Aidan Wills found that the powers in the previous iteration were likely to breach UK privacy rights protected by Article 8 of the Human Rights Act. Can the Minister tell us what legal advice they have received on the proposals contained within this bill?
I have serious concerns that assertions and decisions on individual cases, if automated, could lead to Horizon-style injustices if necessary steps aren't taken to put in the right safeguards, alongside measures to guarantee some level of transparency and accountability when mistakes arise. We are looking at a hugely significant change in our welfare system at a time when this department is responsible for record underpayments. Surely this should be a government priority rather than further upheaval of a system that threatens to further stigmatise those who legitimately rely on the welfare state. There are low levels of fraud within the benefit system. The latest government figures stands at 2.8% of total benefits expenditure, which translates to overpayments due to fraud being recorded at 3.7% in the financial year 23-24. And whilst it is right and proper to look at ways to reduce this, politicians in this place have a responsibility to make clear at every opportunity that every move, such as this, especially those as far-reaching, are intended to target a small minority of criminals. Many of my constituents who I support often tell me that the services they interact with, and by extension the department, tend to view them with suspicion and lack of empathy. This bill cannot be used to entrench such attitudes, Madam Deputy Speaker. For the British public, whether in work or those out of work, life is getting harder. Rampant inequality has broken our economic model, whilst the 1% continue to squeeze the rest. I very much hope this bill will not end up punishing the wrong people and therefore making those inequalities even worse. I look forward to my front bench engaging with those expressing legitimate concerns today and during the course of the parliamentary journey of this bill. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, today I will not oppose a second reading in this place, but I will be looking to see if there are any amendments that I can constructively work with colleagues from across this place that can be tabled at committee stage to alleviate my concerns and the concerns that have been raised by honourable and right honourable members across this House this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In Basset law, most people work hard all their lives, pay their dues and want to live comfortably. They keep themselves to themselves, whether this is in Worksop, Harworth, Retford or the villages. But what unites them in anger is the known benefit fraudster who lives down the street. I've lost count of the number of times that I hear the rage, the sense of injustice and grievance that benefit fraud is happening on their doorstep, and nothing seems to be done about it. With billions of public money lost last year, we welcome this bill in Basset law. At long last, the start of real action against the fraudster. Those milking the system, be it the work shy or feeding the coffers of organised crime. This legislation will, for the first time since the Tony Blair years, give the DWP new anti-fraud powers, bringing it into the digital age. I welcome the new search and seizure powers, bringing the DWP into line with the HMRC's investigatory powers, seizing luxury goods, bags of cash and mobile phones to use as evidence of fraud, taking active control of investigations into criminal gangs who are defrauding the taxpayer. And if it means raids, then let them crack on. I also welcome new, stronger powers to pursue those who receive money that they are not entitled to. And when there is an absolute outright refusal to repay, it is right that their driving licence should be removed. And I welcome that it will be the banks and the building societies who will flag when they spot fraud, such as long-term trips abroad or a wage going in whilst benefits are also being claimed. And whilst government will at last be tough on fraud, the new powers will include strong safeguards to ensure that they are used appropriately, protecting the vulnerable and the sick. The message from today is that if you are living off the wages of fraud, we are coming to get you. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. And this is why I back the additional measure in this bill that will pursue those who ripped us off during COVID, including the previous government's greedy friends who grabbed the PPE contracts and the fake company owners who took the business loans. We are not going to allow time limitations to act as a barrier. We want our money back, the thieves jailed, and anyone who lie in the pockets of their mates also feeling the long hand of the law. I cannot abide the thought of my constituents' hard-earned money funding the luxury lifestyles of the fraudsters. Labour is a party of working people, and this is our values being put into action. This bill is all about fraud. It's a start, not the end, of stamping out corruption, of insider dealing and the defrauding those who strive and save by working hard. This is the start of resetting broken Britain.
Luke Charters.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last but I hope not least. And now I've spent a lot of my career before entering this place tackling fraud. One of the key trends has been an increasing sophistication in how fraud has been conducted. Fraud isn't the art of a local chancer. It's increasingly organised crime groups using elaborate mechanisms and deeply advanced technology to rapidly shift their modus operandi. And that includes benefit fraud gangs. Now, colleagues, I'm sorry to say this, but fraud in the benefit system has reached an industrial scale. And frankly, it's time, through this government, we got a grip on this. And that's why I welcome the government's swift action in bringing this bill forward. Now, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, wrote an excellent op-ed today highlighting this exact point. This is the money of many hard-working Brits, and it's been stolen from right under their noses. The Tories, though, presided over a system which allowed criminals to line their own pockets at the taxpayers' expense.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I just wanted to clarify a point he's just made. He's making a very passionate speech, but he's talking about benefit fraud on an industrial scale. It's just over 2.5%. Does he really believe that that's an industrial scale?
I think, as I will come on to, it's the techniques that these fraud gangs are using. It's industrial-level criminal activity through their advanced techniques. And it was £7 billion that was cheated out of the taxpayers' pocket last year, an issue we've been left to clean up. If we had that cash, we could have funded extra police officers, vital repairs to some of our hospitals, or, frankly, it would have been easier to fund the £22 billion black hole left by the party opposite, wherever they are. But now let me turn to a few concrete examples on why this bill matters. Now, first, there's the economics of the bill. It's expected to save £1.5 billion over the next few years. These are not insignificant sums of money. And it's important to stress the public purse is not an endless pot. It's the contributions of thousands of working people across this country that help to fund it, like many of my constituents in York Outer. They want to see taxpayer money being spent wisely. Stealing benefits isn't just fraud. It's a slap in the face to the hard-working taxpayers that fund our public services. And this bill changes that. It isn't just about keeping more taxpayer cash in the Treasury, though. As Brits, we embody the values of kindness, decency and fairness. While we are rightly outraged about criminals circumventing our system, I think all of us want a reliable welfare state for the people who truly need it. So every pound that a benefit fraud gang steals is a pound less for a low-income single parent looking for a job on universal credit, a pound less for a disabled person on the higher rate of PIP, a pound less for someone on carer's allowance. In many cases, these payments are a lifeline for them getting back to work. But at the moment, this cash is going to criminals rather than carers. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I turn to a few recent cases of organised benefits fraud to elucidate the scale of the challenge we face? All have been settled now in the public domain following prosecutions. In May 2024, we saw the largest benefit fraud case in history. This operation saw 5 Bulgarian nationals forge thousands of documents to make thousands of fraudulent universal credit claims to the value of £50 million. In October 2023, 7 people were sentenced for falsely claiming employment support allowance. And they actually used advanced techniques by hijacking identities, resulting in the crime group stealing hundreds of thousands of pounds. An investigation by the City of London Police in 2020 saw enforcement against a benefit fraud ring to the tune of hundreds of thousands of pounds. And could I just take a brief moment to praise the excellent work of our law enforcement agencies, including the City of London Police, who I've met, for their collaboration. And that was exactly how they closed that last fraud ring. And this example shows the benefits of public-private partnerships in tackling benefits fraud, which this bill seeks to catalyse on. But turning to each of these cases, Madam Deputy Speaker, what do they have in common? They reflect a situation where benefit fraud was actually a predicate crime to other illicit activities. They demonstrate the need to upgrade our response, and this bill represents additional lines of defence in us rising to the challenges we need to fix. And some of the measures in this bill will do exactly that, supporting COVID-era fraud investigations, strengthening the PSFA by establishing it as a separate entity, giving the PSFA powers to compel evidence and enter premises with a warrant, extending the time limit to bring action against historic fraud to 12 years, and extra powers for recovering money. And now I've recently visited the National Economic Crime Centre at the NCA, and I know the scale of the challenges we face when it comes to tackling fraudsters. I've got no doubt that the government, with this bill, will smash the benefit fraud gangs. Yeah. But we must also acknowledge this legislation is a significant shift for the financial industry too. It's a step into a new dawn for those tackling economic crimes in banks who will be spending more time tackling benefit fraud. And Madam Deputy Speaker, it's right that the government is pursuing a growth-first strategy, and that's got to be carefully balanced with the economic crime plan too. The FCA's new consumer duty was an important stride forward for the industry, and I was proud to play a small role in that. But as the scrutiny process on this bill continues, I warmly invite ministers to engage with the FCA and report back to the House on how the new powers will carefully balance consumer vulnerability with the need to drive down benefits fraud. And there is finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, an important scenario that must be considered more carefully as the bill progresses in this place. A victim of domestic abuse, let's call her Jane, is quietly saving money to escape, and then an account information notice is issued. Based on 3 months of bank statements, a debt recovery notice follows. Jane has 28 days to appeal, but no access to legal advice. Worse still, her abuser intercepts the letter, and her savings, her lifeline to escape, are seized. Her escape plan is exposed, putting her at risk. We must ensure that the financial processes in this bill don't accidentally or inadvertently work against victims of domestic abuse in these scenarios, which is a point I am sure ministers are aware of. And to close, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister said in a speech at a recent Labour Party conference, if we want to maintain support for the welfare state, then we will legislate to stop benefit fraud. So when it comes to tackling organised crime groups, not only is he right, but this bill is proof he's delivering on his promise. It's about smashing the benefit fraud gangs, treating taxpayers' money fairly, and ensuring we have a safety net left for the genuinely vulnerable people who need it. And now I refer time and time again to a point I made in my maiden speech that rings as true today as it has ever done. Now I want to make sure that there is no safe harbour for fraudsters, no compromise in our pursuit of their schemes, and no escape from justice.
I call Shadow Minister Rebecca Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it is a pleasure to wind up this important debate on behalf of the official opposition this evening. It's been a really interesting debate, I think we would all agree, with some strong views on both sides of the House, and perhaps not necessarily where you would have expected the disagreement to lie. In fact, it seems that it's the official opposition and the government that are more in agreement than anybody else in the House. But I just want to mention a couple of people, the member from Oldham East and Saddleworth, Torbay, Mid-Leicestershire, my honourable friend made some really valid points. Clwyd North, Doncaster Central, Strangford, and York Outer, I felt at the very end there, made a very interesting point about the connection between violence against women and girls in this bill, which, as we head into committee stage, is something that I think is going to be important to raise. But clearly some very passionate views on the other side, particularly from the Honourable Member from Brighton Pavilion, Aberdeen North, North Antrim, for example. So it's been a very interesting debate all round, I have to say. And just before I get into the main bits of my speech, I suppose, I just wanted to reflect on some of the COVID comments that have been made, because it has been made clear that this bill is a bill in two parts this evening. We have the bits about the Cabinet Office and those existing increasing powers, and also the DWP benefit fraud challenges. And I think it's just worth for the record reflecting on the fact that what the previous government did, particularly under the former Chancellor, the Right Honourable Member for Richmond and North Allerton, saved a huge amount of businesses through the bounce back loans, saved a huge amount of jobs through the furlough scheme, and also provided things like the Kickstart programme, which ultimately, without those things, would have led to even more people needing to claim from the DWP. And it's also worth noting that the National Audit Office have actually said that there is no evidence of ministerial involvement in improper procurement or contract decisions. So for the record, I think it's important to make that here this evening. However, as we have heard, this bill, Madam Deputy Speaker, is a continuation of much that the previous Conservative government was implementing before the election was called. Yet it also contains, as we have heard, some quite concerning extensions to the powers of the new government. A pattern is emerging. Perhaps the government pick up on our previous work, quietly remove some of the more sensible plans, one might say, and add some ill-thought-out ones of their own. My colleague, the Honourable Member for Faversham and Mid-Kent, has already highlighted the record we had in government, which is perhaps something the party opposite seem to have forgotten, but I will in good faith assume that is error rather than fraud on their part this evening. Both, though, in terms of tackling fraud in the welfare system and for fighting public sector fraud. It has been a few hours, though, since my honourable friend shared this record, so allow me to recap. Before the pandemic, we worked hard to secure near record low levels of fraud and error across the DWP welfare and tax credit system. We knew the stress and anxiety experienced by those who have been overpaid, and we were hunting down those who were deliberately misappropriating the system, and our actions were making a difference. However, given the amount of government support provided during the pandemic, it is not surprising that individuals and groups sought to exploit the emergency situation we all faced. So in response to this, we published our Fighting Fraud in the Welfare System paper in May 2022. Madam Deputy Speaker, this crackdown led to a 10% reduction in fraud and error and £1 billion saved through dedicated counter-fraud activities. In addition, an estimated further £1.35 billion was saved between 2023 and 24. However, our ambition did not end here. Last May, we published a further paper, Fighting Fraud in the Welfare System, Going Further, which set out plans to save an additional £9 billion by 2027 to 28 by cracking down on benefits cheats. Now, we've heard this evening about the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, the precursor to Part 2 of the bill before us today. Furthermore, our proposed fraud bill would have aligned the Department for Work and Pensions with HMRC, enabling us to treat benefit fraud in the same way as tax fraud, giving investigators new powers to make seizures and arrests. All this was before we even look at our record of tackling public sector fraud as additionally included in this new bill. Our Taxpayer Protection Task Force, Madam Deputy Speaker, secured around £1.2 billion of money either blocked from being paid out or recovered through our compliance work. We set up the Public Sector Fraud Authority, whose powers we are seeing extended in this bill, to work across government to reduce fraud against the public sector. Its first-year target was £180 million, and that was smashed with savings of £311 million. Our Risk, Threat and Prevention Service was the first in-house fraud squad of its kind in the world when set up in 2023. Working cross-government, it set out to ensure the public purse was protected at key points as new spending programmes or policies were announced. Now, why, you might say, was this important? Because we know that between 2023 and 24 alone, the Public Accounts Committee have found that nearly £1 in every 15 was either error or fraud. It's an eye-watering amount of taxpayer money, and again, something I think the vast majority of us here this evening would agree. The ambition of the bill in terms of the impact of a more powerful public sector fraud authority could lead to around £54 billion being recovered from public sector fraud in 10 years, a welcome figure. However, there is more the government could be doing. We have heard how the taxpayer simply cannot afford the government to stop here. More action is essential. The new government's inaction to date in reforming health and sickness benefits is estimated to have cost the taxpayer approximately £1.8 million since July 2024, which is around £266 million every month. Instead, the new government has gone after pensioners, employers and farmers instead, actions they were ready and waiting to take without delay. Yet here we are, 7 months into a new parliament with not a peep on how they will reform the benefit system, other than repeating that they'll come up with a plan soon. And indeed, they had 14 years to come up with that plan. Every day, Labour ducks the tough questions. The benefits bill continues to grow. However, taking a step back, it is important to remember why we have a benefits or welfare system in the first place. I am sure that across the House we are agreed that it is morally right for the state to provide for the most vulnerable, those who, for no fault of their own, need financial support to provide for themselves or their family. In debating the bill before us today, it is easy to forget that in the majority of cases, beneficiaries of additional support from the state do it simply to get on with their lives and are not a cause for concern. However, as the title of this bill suggests, there is a need to recover public money that has been claimed either in error or because of fraud, as a result of an innocent mistake or with deliberate intent. This is, after all, as we have heard multiple times this evening, taxpayer money that has ended up in the wrong bank account and needs rectifying. So that is why, as we have already made clear, we support this bill in principle. My honourable friend, the member for Faversham and Mid-Kent, has set out a number of questions which I hope the honourable member across will address in his summing up remarks shortly. Unsurprisingly, we remain concerned about the final details of the legislation and the huge absence of a plan to tackle the rapidly rising benefits bill. However, we look forward to debating the details of this bill further throughout committee stage shortly and working cross-party to ensure that we see further progress made. First and foremost, Madam Deputy Speaker, we must see money from the public purse fairly and squarely in the hands of those it is intended for, and not in the hands of the fraudsters working to line their own pockets.
I call the Minister, Andrew West.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I hope that the House will bear with me in that I have binned the speech that I was originally going to give in closing, given the number of contributions that we have heard and indeed some of the legitimate questions and concerns that have been set out by colleagues. I'd like to begin, though, by thanking those colleagues who rightfully highlighted the scale of the challenge and why the government must act to tackle fraud against the public sector. The members for Burnley, Clwyd North, Hendon, Doncaster Central, Bassett Law and York Outer all set out the scale of that challenge and the views of their constituents on this issue in very robust terms. Could I say, in particular to my honourable friend, the member for York Outer, that I absolutely agree with him about the risk of unintended consequences here, particularly on the issue of violence against women and girls. This is something that we are looking at closely and will continue to do so. Could I also raise a general point that was made by a number of members, Madam Deputy Speaker, about the alleged lack of an impact assessment or the publication of such. This has been published alongside the view of the RPC committee and is available for colleagues to view. But turning, Madam Deputy Speaker, to specific contributions from those who raised some concerns about the bill, starting with the Shadow Secretary of State. And I do welcome the tone of the party opposite and the broad support that they have for a number of the principles in the bill. She is correct that it is incumbent on the state to get its money back. It is part of the unwritten contract that she referred to. I have to say, I felt there was a slightly tenuous justification for the escalation of benefit fraud that we've seen in recent years, the war in Ukraine, but I know that we are happy to blame Putin for many things. That's just a new one on me. She did rightly point to an escalation of benefit fraud and error as a result of COVID. But that does not explain why the level of fraud and error in the Department for Work and Pensions was higher in 2023-24 than in any of the years from 21-22 onwards. 9.7 billion last year, a record level. This is getting worse, not better, and that happened on their watch. She went on to suggest that the contents of their fraud plan would have solved all of these problems, and indeed that we are copying much of what was in there. It is fair to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the party opposite had only in fact legislated on the third-party data measure within that plan. They had never mentioned debt recovery powers, made no efforts to get a grip on the public sector fraud with the new powers that we are bringing forward by putting the PSFA on a statutory footing. Overall, their appalling record comes as hardly a surprise. She went on to say that she was concerned about the amount of information being shared by banks. Just to be clear, we will not be sharing any information with banks. The information that will be coming back to us will have very strict criteria, and we are taking a specific power to fine banks for oversharing information that is out of scope. She asked what testing has been done on this. 2 trials have been undertaken, so we know that this is a proposal that will work as it pertains to the eligibility verification measures. She then went on with some audacity, in my view, to challenge whether the debt recovery powers went far enough, powers that the party opposite refused to take and never put forward when they were in government. She mentioned AI schemes and the number of schemes that have been set aside. Test and learn in the AI space is perfectly normal, and I would remind her that of some of those schemes that have not been taken forward, they are actually now moving through under different names. She mentioned the PSFA and the right to compel information and raised concerns about this. These powers have independent oversight to ensure their use is proportionate, so while no organisations are exempt, all actions are considered within a robust legal framework. We then heard, astonishingly from the party opposite, that there is nothing in this bill to get a grip on the benefits bill. What a cheek, Madam Deputy Speaker, when the benefits bill spiralled some £20 billion under their watch. And as for their so-called plan, I would remind the Shadow Secretary of State that they made a hash of it, and we lost a JR on their failed plan just a few weeks ago. So we will take our time to bring forward those proposals, we will get them right, and we will consult on those. Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am grateful for the support of the party opposite, but I really hope that that will manifest itself in the voting lobbies later, because I have to say that with the exception of the member sat behind the Shadow Secretary of State, who I believe is a member of the front bench team as the PPS, we have not had a single contribution from a Conservative member in terms of a full speech, just one intervention. If that does not show the lack of seriousness with which they take this issue, then the appalling record and position that we have inherited should do just that. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to spend a little time on the comments of the Chair of the Select Committee, because I know that she is a champion for vulnerable people. I can't see her in her... I can now see her in her place. And I want to particularly talk to the measures that we are taking to assure ourselves of appropriate support for vulnerable people, both within the scope of the bill, but also more generally, because I think this is important and goes to a number of the other comments that we've had from members. So the first thing that I would say is that it is always the Department's priority to set repayment plans that are affordable and sustainable, that we make use of the debt respite scheme breathing space that allows for a temporary protection from creditors, that we provide additional support to help customers manage their money. We work with the Money and Pension Service under its brand name Money Helper, who offer free, independent, impartial money and debt advice, and indebted customers are routinely offered a referral, with the majority of those meeting the criteria taking up that offer. But In addition, Madam Deputy Speaker, a DWP debt management vulnerability framework has recently been introduced to provide guidance for advisors on how to support customers who are at risk of becoming vulnerable, including signposting to specialist support. This is embedded across debt management, and part of this involves advisors undertaking annual refresher training and on identifying and supporting customers experiencing vulnerability. Within the scope of this bill, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is important to recognise that this power of debt recovery will not be used on benefit claimants. It extends only to those who receive their income either through means other than benefits or through payroll employment. There are also important safeguards in the bill that govern the process of debt recovery and these new enforcement powers. So there will be repeated efforts at contact before any enforcement action, affordability checks before any deductions are taken from bank accounts, limits on the size of those deductions, a right to review deduction orders, a right to appeal deduction orders beyond that, and the DWP can vary or suspend the deduction order following a change in circumstances. At any point, I will give way.
Question on affordability. I appreciate the government has made changes around affordability, but they still don't assess either benefit clawbacks or the deductions on the basis of whether it's actually affordable for the people that are having to pay them back. Are they planning to put that in at some point in the future?
Forgive me if I've not understood the Honourable Lady correctly, but there is specific provision within the bill on the debt recovery powers to limit the amount that can be clawed back to 40% of anybody's capital. But if I have misunderstood that, I'm happy to have a conversation with her afterwards. But I hope that does set out some of the steps that we have taken both in the bill and more broadly to ensure support for vulnerable people. Turning to the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, the Honourable Gentleman from Torbay, he is quite right to highlight the scale of COVID fraud and the lack of safeguards in place to protect the public purse. He highlighted the carers allowance review, and that will report this summer, not next. But we are already learning the lessons of that. And much like the proposals in this bill, data is key. So we have secured funding to extend the VEPS system of alerts from HMRC to 100% of claims, and will ensure in this bill that the EVM information is processed quickly to reduce large overpayments and avoid a repeat of what happened on the last government's watch with carers' allowance. He raised the use of AI, as indeed did the chair of the Select Committee. There will always be a human decision maker in each of these powers. So where decisions are made, a human, not AI, will make that call. For EVM, a flag would be passed to a human to establish benefit eligibility. For debt recovery, passed to a human to assess vulnerability and the ability to pay. For information gathering, passed to a human for investigation on where there is a suspicion of fraud. And for search and seizure, a warrant would be granted from a judge. At all times, a human making those decisions as is right and proper, given the powers we are talking about here. Turning to the Honourable Member for Mid-Leicestershire, it's no doubt, according to him, that had they had longer, Conservative policies would have driven down fraud further and faster than our proposals would do. Well, thankfully, Madam Deputy Speaker, we do not have the opportunity to test that theory, because given their appalling record, escalating fraud and error every year since the pandemic, 9.7 billion last year, I dread to think what they do when they turn their attention to this. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, he went on to ask, would the independent person report on use of powers? Yes, and those reports would be placed annually before Parliament, both on the PSFA side of the powers and on the DWP. He asked about non-drivers and what is the point of suspending driving licences when not everybody drives. Well, short of taking the power to prevent somebody from walking, I fail to see how much further we could have gone in that regard, Madam Deputy Speaker. However, I recognise, and I hope he does too, that is only one of a suite of measures that we are looking at to move us forward in terms of the powers available to us. Of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is important to recognise that the introduction of an independent person at all was not considered necessary by the party opposite on the third-party data measures they proposed under the DPDI bill, and yet we are introducing that not just for the PSFA powers, not just for the eligibility verification measures, but for information gathering powers and powers of search and seizure also. Turning to the comments of the member for Brighton Pavilion, and I understand that she is concerned, but I have to say that I fundamentally disagree with the idea that it is conservative to want to tackle benefit fraud, that we should ignore £7.4 billion worth of welfare fraud last year, and I certainly don't think that it is conservative to go after public sector fraud. In fact, if it was slightly more conservative, we may not be in the terrible position we are now. We then heard from the member from Normanton and Hemsworth, and he actually raised a number of very important questions. I'd be delighted to meet with him to discuss them further, because I think that time would preclude me from running through all of those, but I was especially concerned to hear about the case that he raised. One of the potential benefits of the eligibility verification measure, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that it will in fact allow us to detect overpayments earlier, but clearly we want to make sure that the DWP is handling such issues correctly first time. On the question of the ICO, which was raised by a number of members, including the honourable gentleman, just to clear this up, it was not a letter received into the department. The ICO published their findings on and thoughts on the bill at this stage today on the ICO's website. It recognises the steps that we have taken on proportionality, and I welcome those comments. The member for Brecon had concerns about banks and the erosion of potential data protection powers. That is not my view. This will involve very limited data sharing. We are not monitoring accounts as the Department for Work and Pensions, and we will fine banks if they overshare in this space. The member for Aberdeen North made what I thought was a really important contribution, but just to clarify that this bill is not predicated on saving £10 billion on welfare fraud. It sets out to save £1.5 billion over 5 years, but it is part of overall measures to save £8.6 billion over the period, because we do not accept the level of fraud that we have in the system at present. The member for Coventry South suggested that the bill subjects millions of people to unwarranted financial surveillance. Just to give absolute clarity to members, we will not receive transactional information from banks, we will not be looking in bank accounts directly, and we will not be asking banks to take decisions as to whether somebody has committed fraud. The honourable member for North Antrim raised the question of Clause 50 on the PSFA side of the bill and what constitutes fraud. For clarity, it is standard for powers to be taken by the Secretary of State or the Minister in this case. But of course, in practice, what will happen is that it will be qualified and experienced decision makers who look at those cases as authorised officers. He then went on to raise Clause 91 and the driving licence removal, and I would just gently say to the honourable gentleman, this is an existing power held by the Child Maintenance Service. The question of liable persons and whether it is proportionate would be a matter for a judge. It would only happen after repeated attempts to secure repayment, and before any disqualification occurs, an individual will always be given the opportunity to agree a repayment plan. This is a power of last resort, but I assure him if he has specific concerns about the pursuit of fraud in Northern Ireland, that is something I am very happy to follow up. Turning to the honourable member for Strangford, who, as always, was speaking from the heart about the plight of his constituents and the challenges that they face, I want to assure him this is not a bill that is intended to focus on the low-lying fruit of vulnerable people. That's why we have some of the protections that I set out earlier, and that's why we are putting in place independent oversight for the debt recovery and eligibility verification measures. He asked about the right of appeal. Yes, the right of review and of appeal against a ruling in the debt recovery space is written into this bill. The important question of appointees is one that I want to address very directly, and the sister of his constituent who he raised. To be very clear, this is something that we had significant concerns about after the previous introduction of the third-party data measure, and the system will remove appointees. There may be circumstances where those bank accounts need to be checked if the appointee receives benefit themselves, but if they do not, they will be screened out. I will.
Of the individuals who are going to do the independent assessment. The individuals doing the independent assessment will be appointed by the Secretary of State, and then they will do the independent assessment. Would it not be better for Parliament to agree the appointment of those individuals so that we can be assured that they're actually independent?
Well, clearly we will inform Parliament as to who that will be, but we will go through a proper recruitment process. If you're talking about the independent person to be appointed on the eligibility verification measure, we will go through a thorough recruitment process to ensure that they have the expertise needed. They will report every year to Parliament, and it is right and appropriate that they do so. Turning to my honourable friend, the right honourable friend from Hayes and Harlington, I thank him for his support for Part 1 of the bill, but I do understand the concerns he has with the powers as they pertain to the Department for Work and Pensions. Banks not being perhaps able to exercise the powers appropriately was one of his principal concerns. This is intended not as a decision-making action, but as a data push. Banks will not make decisions. It will be a human who carries out that investigation within the DWP. Where he raises concerns about potential errors in the system, I want to be clear that we acknowledge this is a new power. We intend to scale it up in a test and learn phase, and on that basis gradually, so that we can get it right. But we simply cannot ignore the problem and not look to take these powers when we have a £7.4 billion problem last year with fraud in the DWP. Turning to the honourable member for Horsham, I think I dealt with the carers allowance overpayments question already and what we are doing to start to put that right. Just to clarify again, we are not accessing bank accounts. Banks will be doing that for us, but they will not be taking decisions as to somebody's benefit eligibility. He said that we should look at the efficacy of existing powers to request information. We are doing that through the updating of information gathering powers, the right to compel information digitally, and we will be moving to a list of excluded organisations rather than a list of organisations who we are able to compel information from. Madam Deputy Speaker, finally to my honourable friend for Liverpool Wavertree. She did raise a series of concerns, and I know that she does this coming from a good place. I am very, very happy to meet with her to discuss some of those powers. I think it's important that we get it right, but on the particular question of the legal advice and Article 8, I do just want to say that she is correct that Big Brother Watch did commission some legal opinion, but we are confident that the powers in this bill are compatible with the ECHR. They are different powers, distinct from the third-party data powers put forward as part of the DPDI bill. We do think they're compatible, including the right to private life under Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, specifically because the third-party data elements are now narrower, and because we've included the safeguards that I've already set out. We think the measures are justified in accordance with the law and are proportionate. The final contribution was from the opposition spokesperson, and again I felt it was constructive, if slightly fantastical at points. I may disagree about the extent to which they had more sensible plans that have since been abandoned by this government. And I note on the question of public sector fraud, she pointed to action taken to try and claw back public money. Can I suggest to her that the party opposite seek to put that in a press release, because if they are not enough of a laughingstock because of their behaviour in this space previously, they would be after seeking to claim that they had a positive story to tell in that space. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will finish by reiterating the comments of my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State. Whoever you are, big businesses, COVID fraudsters, organised criminal gangs seeking to defraud the system, or individuals who are knowingly cheating their benefits. It is not acceptable. We have a major problem, and we are taking the powers needed to act.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many that appear say aye? Aye! Of the contrary, no? No! Aye!
The question is, as on the order paper, as many that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. No. Tell us for the ayes are Martin McCluskey and Tawe Awatemi. Tell us for the noes are Wendy Chamberlain and Susan Murray. Order, order.
The ayes to the right, 343. The noes to the left, 87.
The ayes to the right, 343. The noes to the left, 87. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. Programme motion to be moved formally. Formally. The question is, as on the order paper, as many that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Money resolution to be moved formally. Formally. The question is, as on the order paper, as many that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it.